Vincent responded that everything was fine because Ray had been a great help to him since he had started working for him. He explained that thanks to him, and the training he gives to all the guards, thefts and fights at the auction house were at their lowest in history. Despite understanding that it was an honor for Mr. Vincent to repay his father. In this way, Arthur still said that one of the things he wanted to do was help his sister speed up her awakening using the method he had discovered. He said that he knew that neither Vincent nor his wife were mages, so he said that he would help Lilia achieve awakening along with his sister. With a confident look, he said that he believed that he could help their daughter awaken as a mage and enroll in Xyrus Academy. Vincent couldn't believe his words, but still agreed to give him the opportunity to at least try to do it, remembering how many miracles this young man had demonstrated over the past 3 days. Returning to his room, Arthur continued his diligent training. He tried his best to develop the will of the beast, but even after all this time since receiving it, he could only use the ability for a few seconds. He sighed heavily, thinking that this was still not enough. He was still far from the level of power that Varian and Cynthia possessed. Even though Sylvia had asked him to enjoy this childhood, knowing the life path he had taken as King Gray, Arthur still couldn't back down. His new life was full of colors and happy moments. However, even so, he understood that just like in his past life, he still needed strength to protect those dear to him. One rainy day during his past life, he ran away from the orphanage as usual to provide them with provisions. However, this time when he returned home, he saw a police car parked outside the orphanage, with a crowd of people gathered around it. As he approached the cordoned-off area, he saw paramedics covering his best friend's body with a blanket. This moment changed his life forever. The helpless boy, who at such a young age experienced a horrific trauma, was eventually able to escape poverty and become a king only through his own perseverance. The tragedy that changed his life was the loss of a loved one. This time, he trained to the point of unconsciousness in order to gain power not for revenge like last time, but to protect those close to him. Sylvia, seeing her father's concern, distracted him from his anxious thoughts with good news. Stroking her head, Arthur agreed that she was right and the family had returned home. Remembering his promise to Mr. Vincent, he got dressed and left the room. As he walked down the stairs, he saw his mother and Tabitha's concern, and how tense they were. He thought something had happened during their walk, but it turned out to be something else. Their confusion was due to Vincent telling them about the deal. Alice, worried about her son's promise, approached him first, asking how he was going to help Lilia awaken as a mage. She sternly said that even as a harmless joke, it was too insensitive to her. After a heart-to-heart talk with her daughter, Tabitha also couldn't understand his motives, and said that if this was a joke, then he had gone too far. Even though Mom and Mrs. Tabitha didn't take his words seriously, he replied that he would never joke about something like that. Among them, only Vincent was calm, and he said with a satisfied face that Arthur had promised to show them the process as soon as they returned. Taking his 8-year-old daughter in his arms, he suggested that everyone hurry up and go to the living room. Despite Arthur's calmness, Alice and Tabitha were still worried, realizing how worried Lilia was about the fact that she could not awaken her magical abilities for so long. When they entered the living room, the boy asked his parents to sit down on the sofa, and he sat Lilia and Ellie next to him on the carpet. Touching their backs, he said that he now wanted them to breathe the way he asked them to. Manhwa was best felt during slow, deep breaths that occurred in precise, rhythmic patterns. He hoped that this explanation would be enough for them to figure out how to master it. Vincent, as the only positively minded adult, didn't even doubt Arthur, so he supported him with the words that the first step to magic is to breathe in a special way. In response to these words, Ellie, who had Sylvia asleep in her arms, said that she could breathe easily. Arthur explained, with a smile, that this would not be normal breathing, but promised that if she could do it, then she would become as strong as her older brother. Ellie was very inspired by his words, so she showed her determination by repeating that she would become strong like her brother. Even though she was only a little girl, Arthur had no choice but to hope that she would be able to understand his instructions. Touching their backs, he closed his eyes and repeated the breathing that had him focused enough to feel the mana. He then asked them to take a deep breath through their nose until they could breathe no more, then open their mouths and breathe in again. After this, he asked to exhale this air in small bursts about 15 times. This explanation turned out to be quite effective, because both Lilia and Ellie were able to repeat after him the first time. He then asked them to do this again with their eyes closed, continuing until they saw beautiful lights floating in the darkness. An excited Tabitha watched this with the hope that this really wasn't some kind of joke, while Vincent was glad that there was a real chance of success. Suddenly, Ellie shouted cheerfully that she saw beautiful lights. However, a moment later, she became sad, saying that they disappeared as suddenly as they appeared. Exhaling demonstratively, Arthur explained that the lights disappeared because she stopped breathing. Lilia, who was trying her best to do everything right, said in a worried voice that she still couldn't see them. She felt inferior even compared to Ellie, so she said that something was wrong with her. Arthur reassured her that everything was fine. Alice, although she trusted her son in this situation, wanted to hear from him personally what he was trying to do. Tabitha was no less skeptical. She said that although she knew what he wanted to do, and that she did not doubt his skills, she called these attempts pointless. In response, Arthur said that he was going to help them do what he did to awaken at the age of 3. The only reason he thought he could do it was because of his affinity with all the elements. He thought about it in his head, but he wanted to make sure. Tabitha called the awakening training unprecedented since it should happen naturally, but Arthur replied curtly that they should just observe. He decided to see if it worked as well in practice as it did in theory. Placing his hands on their backs, he warned that they might feel a slight heat in their bodies. But even there, they should still breathe as he had told them earlier. He then began using his own mana and pouring it into Lilia and Ellie's bodies in small amounts. As soon as he tried to do this, Lily said with a joyful face that she saw the lights that Arthur spoke of. Ellie also saw the mana particles again and even said that it was very beautiful. Continuing to pour a small amount of mana into them, Arthur asked them to try to mentally gather all these white spots together. Ellie did not understand why this should be done, so her brother said that they, like friends, should be together. After 10 minutes of such training, Arthur was completely exhausted, as were his students. Sighing heavily and wiping the sweat from his face, he said that this was all he could do for one evening. As soon as he said that the lesson was over, Alice and Lilia's parents jumped up and joyfully ran up to him. First of all, Mr. Vincent asked with great hope for the best how everything went and whether his daughter would be able to become a mage. Arthur answered that it would take several years, and if he continued to train with them for several months, then Lilia would not have any problems. Before he could finish saying that now her awakening would happen much faster and more effectively, Mistress Tabitha hugged him with tears on her face. She began to sincerely apologize for doubting him, and also thank him for being able to give their child many opportunities that they didn't have because they couldn't become mages. Lily was glad to see her mother so sincere and happy. She herself was pleased that she finally felt what mana was. Looking at her father, she was surprised to see tears appear on his face for the first time in her life. After this, Arthur's life returned to its usual rhythm. Every morning he trained to achieve progress and strength. After that, he helped his sister and Lilia get closer to their awakening. Regular training of one's own body was not limited to developing the will of the beast. He continued to develop the elements under his control with considerable success, and even managed to strengthen his control over ice. Even with his impatience to become stronger, he still tried to spend time with everyone. He understood perfectly well that Sylvia wanted his childhood to be exactly like this. After all, with such power, he could be a child until the moment when he had to use it. He did not think that he would have the opportunity to spend his time like this in the future. 2 months at this pace flew by quickly. The day came to meet the guests. Ray was very excited that he would be able to see the twins' horns again. Quite a lot of water had passed under the bridge, but he couldn't wait for this moment. On the other hand, Arthur couldn't find a place for himself. He was constantly circling around the entrance to the mansion, waiting for the moment of meeting. Sensing her dad's anxiety, Sylvia decided to help him. She jumped onto his shoulder with a great running start, almost knocking him to the ground. Barely able to stay on his feet, Arthur told her that he wasn't sure she was still small enough to continue riding on his shoulder. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the front door. Arthur had been waiting for this meeting for a long time, so he opened the door and began to greet the guys. However, at that very moment, Angela pounced on him and crushed him with her chest, tearfully talking about how hard it was for him, even though he was still so young. She was suddenly interrupted by a big guy from the team, who noticed that Arthur was having trouble breathing. Having let go of Arthur, who really did not mind dying from such suffocation, Angela apologized for her manners and explained such behavior by the fact that she was a little emotional from their long-awaited meeting. Raising his head, Arthur saw Durden and said, was surprised that he had grown taller. Although he was the healthiest and most physically strong guy in their adventurer team, it was only his appearance that was cold, not his heart. With genuine tears of happiness on his face, he sat down next to Arthur and said that he was glad to see him after what had happened. The next guy who appeared in front of them was a cheeky guy who said he thought the game plan was to put a happy face on the kid. Seeing Angela and Durden's tears, Adam couldn't understand why they, experienced adventurers, were greeting Arthur in such a way. As soon as he noticed the black manabeast behind the boy, he wondered in surprise why no one was going to speak up about it. However, at that very moment, Helen came up and with a kind smile, she began to press Adam with her bow so that he would stop being insolent to the others. After which she told Arthur that he could ignore all sorts of rude people. With a sincere and sweet smile, she added that they were very happy to see him already grown up and even more handsome. With difficulty freeing himself from the grip, Adam said it was rude to call him a bad boy for not crying. He believed that it was not his fault that he was old enough to control himself. At that moment, the last, most shy and modest member of their team ran between Adam and Helen. Jasmine ran past the boys with tears in her eyes and threw herself at Arthur with hugs. Hugging him tightly, she began to apologize in a trembling voice. During this time, she also grew noticeably because in order to hug Arthur, she had to kneel. At this touching moment, even Adam, who called himself an adult, also began to cry, trying to hide his tears from Helen. Alice and Ray, who were previously part of the team, also could not hide their tears of joy from reuniting with their comrades, as well as their long-awaited meeting with Arthur. It was time for the anniversary event. Mr. Vincent had prepared the most luxurious outfit possible. His captain of security, Ray, was also dressed in rather expensive clothes. Vincent wondered if his friend was sure that the event did not require mages inside. Ray thought that shouldn't be a problem, since they had Angela and another windcrafter rotating the detection barriers around the auction house, as well as Durden guarding the main entrance. Besides, he didn't want people to think they were preparing for war. Satisfied that Ray had thought through the strategy to protect their event well, he said with a cheerful laugh that he was really grateful that their old team had agreed to help with security. Ray himself was glad that the Twin Horns agreed to help, because thanks to them, he was able to place several guards outside around the block next to the auction house. Winking, he confidently said that they could handle any threat from outside, so that the guests would be safe and the auction house would not be destroyed. In response to his words, Vincent said a little excitedly that although Ray was joking, after his recent experience with the mages on his lawn, he really wanted to make him keep that promise. He hoped that it would not come to the point where Ray and Arthur would use their formidable elements. Reminiscing about the incredible boy, he mentioned that Arthur had asked him to find a sword before he registered as an adventurer. However, considering Ray's gauntlet fighting style, he never thought that he would teach him how to fight with swords. It was awkward to say, but Ray admitted that the only thing he had done for Arthur in this matter was buy him a wooden sword, and that he had been teaching himself since he was 4. Vincent was once again shocked to learn when the little boy had begun his fencing training. After these words, Ray still mentioned that although his son says that he is self-taught, however, several times when they sparred, he felt that there were moments when a strange aura emanated from the little boy. Vincent wanted to know what his friend meant by the strange aura. As an example, a father, worried about his son's behavior, mentioned that Arthur had such a calculating confidence as if he had been fighting for decades. Even though Ray said it as if it were the pure truth, Vincent was too skeptical and replied that he should think about the fact that he was attributing too much to his son because he did not live even 10 years. It was hard to disagree with that logical conclusion, but Ray admitted that when they fought, there were times when Arthur would suddenly stumble or get confused, as if he wasn't used to his own body. Suddenly Vincent beamed, saying he thought he knew the exact reason. Ray looked at him hopefully, thinking that their son's biggest secret would be revealed. However, Vincent explained all these oddities by early puberty. Being disappointed with such an answer, Ray suggested that they quickly go downstairs, where they were most likely already waiting for them. As they approached the stairs, Tabitha complained that the two of them were taking too long, not understanding how 2 grown men could be the last ones ready. Looking at the boys, Vincent was pleasantly surprised, and said that they all looked simply amazing. Indeed, having prepared for the auction event, they all dressed in excellent suits, as befits those present at such an anniversary event. Back downstairs, Vincent apologized for making them all wear only black and white. He explained that as the hosts of the event, they didn't want to stand out in front of the guests. But he still felt a little bad about making Ray's family conform to the dress code as well. However, the Levins were more than satisfied with such clothes. Alice, with a cheerful expression on her face, said that there was no problem with this, and she herself was usually embarrassed by bright colors. Only Arthur was truly unhappy with this way of dressing. When he dressed like this, he knew that no matter what he wore, he still looked like some cute kid. His manners weren't enough to command respect, so he couldn't wait to grow up. Everyone was ready, so Mr. Vincent suggested not to delay. Clapping his hands, he walked up to the front door and said that if everything was okay, then it was time for them to go, as their carriages were already waiting. Near the door, he stopped Arthur, placing his hand on his shoulder. Vincent mentioned that he had already heard that his daughter had made great progress in the past 2 months of Manhwa strengthening training. He also pleased the talented guy with the words that if Lilia continues in the same spirit, then she will soon be able to wake up and have time to enter the Xyrus Academy. With an incredibly kind and sincere look, Vincent thanked him again for doing such a great favor for their daughter. Modest and smiling, Arthur replied that he was simply fulfilling his end of the bargain. He also said that he hoped to see some wonderful things in their auction house, to which Vincent replied that he would help him buy what he wanted. After this short conversation with an exchange of compliments, they joined the others. Several carriages, which they used to travel through the city center, were heading towards the auction house. The road was not long, but during this time, the guys managed to discuss the latest news. Ray and Alice rode in the same carriage with the Helstia family. Tabitha and her friend discussed their outfits while Vincent reread his prepared welcoming speech. Arthur remained in the carriage with the twin horns, where he told the boys about his journey after falling off the cliff. After hearing this incredible story, Adam remarked that he could not believe that he had to go through all this after falling off the cliff. In turn, Helen noted that, all things considered, at least he had found his own mana beast, which was something that even experienced adventurers and nobles could rarely obtain. Speaking about Sylvie, who attracted Jasmine's gaze, Arthur noted with a smile that this was precisely why she was so special to him. Their conversation was interrupted by the screeching sound of the carriage braking. Looking out the window, Angela said that it looked like they were already there. The auction house employees opened the door and politely greeted their guests. The boys slowly walked out into the street. Looking around, Arthur was amazed by the size of the building. The Helstia auction house was so incredible that it could be compared to the castles of the kingdom's representatives. Indeed, this place was in perfect harmony with the wealth of this family. On this day, the place looked even better because it was prepared for the anniversary. The 10th anniversary of the Helstia auction house was an event that the nobles and adventurers were very excited about. It was not only a celebration, but also an opportunity to see and possibly purchase priceless artifacts that were locked away and guarded for this special occasion. Walking inside, Arthur could not stop in one place because he was surrounded by many interesting things. There were many beast cores here that could not be found on the streets of Xyrus, and some of the items that were being brought to auction were completely incomprehensible and raised many questions. The exterior of this building was amazing, but the inside was no less delightful. Addressing his colleagues, Vincent said that everything was fine and they should not worry, knowing that they had to work on such a big day. He encouraged them with a positive attitude to collect their thoughts and make sure that they did not make any mistakes. In turn, Ray, who was in charge of the security guys, gave orders to the teams regarding the protection of entrances and checking routes. Arthur was very happy to see the boys in such a mood, especially his father. His behavior at work was very different from usual. Helen, standing next to him, noted that after all, his father was the leader and did everything he could. She also mentioned that he was the one who made them what they are before, and although she has matured since taking his place, she still has a hard time matching his leadership talent. She slapped Arthur on the shoulder and moved on, saying that she was going to join the rest of the security team. As he said goodbye, Arthur wished her good luck and then went to fetch his mother and Mrs. Tabitha. Ellie and Lilia were with them. They decided to go inside while Vincent and Ray were supposed to join them a little later, having finished all their business. As they walked inside, Arthur saw for the first time how huge the auction house hall was. It was simply huge and looked amazing with its expensive decorations and red carpets. Looking up at the stage, Arthur saw the auctioneer who would be conducting the event. He was a very well-known person, a welcome presence at every auction event. No less interesting were the special places, the balconies, from which the most important guests of the auction house took part. Arthur was delighted, and even though he was a king and lived side by side with the royal family and Eleanor, it still impressed him. Noticing the glint in the boy's eyes, Tabitha asked him what he thought of their Helstia auction house, which he had visited for the first time. In response, he said that calling it an auction house was a gross understatement of what the place actually was. Tabitha liked his compliment, and his mother Alice, surprised by his ability to say such things, responded with a pleasant laugh. Lilia tapped him on the arm and said with anticipation that he should wait until he saw the private viewing rooms upstairs. As befits the family that owned the house, they had their own space among the private viewing rooms. When they arrived, the polite worker who had escorted them to the place opened the door for them and invited them inside. The place that was their private room was more spacious than most of the rooms in the Helstia family mansion. Seeing how magnificent the auction house was, he was excited to see what kind of items they were going to auction. Tabitha distracted him from his thoughts and suggested that everyone make themselves comfortable and have fun, because after Vincent's return, they would be receiving special guests. It was not yet known who they were talking about, but it was clear that these were people of very high status. Mrs. Tabitha and Alice left the children by the sofas on the observation deck, while they themselves went to their private bar to order something to drink. Lily, who was leading Arthur and Ellie, suggested that they quickly go to the window, since the opening ceremony was just beginning. Looking down, Ellie cried out in delight. The viewing platform was simply amazing, offering a view of all the venues, as well as the stage where the auction took place. There were a lot of people here, and they all gradually took their places. Returning to the children with a cocktail in hand, Tabitha asked what they were doing. She thought it was cute how little Ellie was trying to count everyone who had come, distracting the little girl from her strange activity. Lily suggested that she play a game with clapping her hands. Everyone was busy with their own affairs while waiting for the celebration to begin. As befits women, Mrs. Tabitha and Alice were discussing some gossip, which became even more interesting after a few sips of alcohol. Arthur, who was left practically alone, was glad to watch them, because they were all having fun. Suddenly, one of the auction house's subordinates came to them, and apologizing for the intrusion, announced that VIP guests had arrived at the building and would soon be brought to this private room. Hearing this news, they put aside their business and stood facing the entrance, waiting for those guests. Together with the workers of this house, Mr. Vincent himself met them. First, valiant knights in white armor and red cloaks entered, and after them came a mysterious magician with a powerful cane and a crimson hooded cape. Addressing his family and those present in the room, Vincent introduced the guests with joy and solemnity. As it turned out, those guests were His Majesty Blaine Glader, Her Majesty Priscilla Glader, Prince Curtis, and Princess Caitlin. As Arthur and the others knelt, he felt the same as he had in Ellenmore when he had been in the presence of royalty. Seeing the strangers before him, King Blaine, turning to his friend Vincent, said that he did not know that they would be sharing this space with other guests. Feeling some pressure in these words, Vincent worriedly apologized for his presumption. He explained his decision by remembering that he wanted to meet his family again when they were here last time. Based on this, he thought that today would be the most appropriate time to do so. He then reintroduced his wife Tabitha and daughter Lilia. After introducing his family, Mr. Vincent introduced the Levin family, saying that they were the wife of his close friend and their children, Arthur and Eleanor. Thus, he managed to change the king's attitude, and he cheerfully replied that Vincent's friends were his friends too. After these words, he asked those present to stand up, saying that they were here to congratulate Helstia on the 10th anniversary of the wonderful place and to enjoy the event. Queen Priscilla echoed her husband's sentiments, and said that they did not need to remain so formal on a day when they should be enjoying life. As an example, she said that she was glad that they would at least have some company other than their guards. Meanwhile, Sylvie woke up as usual, resting in her free time from the excess attention from Ellie. Seeing her in front of them, the royal family, who had nothing like this at their disposal, remarked that the boy's mana beast was very cute. Priscilla was surprised that although it looked like a reptile, it was smarter. Arthur replied that Sylvie had hatched only a few months ago. When he asked her to say hello to the royal family, Sylvie squealed sweetly in a happy tone, which attracted their attention even more. The king was surprised by such an unusual creature, seeing the affection on the part of his wife. When he asked if this mana beast was connected with Arthur, he answered that it was so, and they had a very close connection. Reaching out his hand to the cute and friendly beast, the king remarked that the young man was very lucky, because even baby beasts are difficult to tame, while she seemed very obedient. In response, Arthur surprised them by being able to communicate mentally, which was more like mutual agreement. After these words, they were interrupted by an unexpected cry from a shocked magician. Arthur was not thrilled when he realized he had said something out of the ordinary. This mysterious man, who was the king's mage, threw off his hood and shouted in surprise that he was shocked that they had an equal contract with this beast. The boy hesitantly replied that she was the one who initiated it. The king's children also thought about this information, because they were very educated and knew very well how low the chances of such a contract were. Inspired by this shocking information, the magician ran closer and suddenly grabbed Arthur's hand, saying that he wanted to take a closer look at their connection. Fortunately, he was interrupted by King Blaine himself, whose touch made the mage tremble. The king asked his ward to abandon the idea, as he had chosen an inappropriate time to study some pet as he was on duty. After these words, the mage whom the king called by the name Sebastian obediently knelt before him and apologized in a trembling voice. Judging by his name, he was one of those who had been pursuing Arthur's family due to their interest in Sylvie. Their pleasant acquaintance and special interest in Sylvia suddenly became a moment of conflict. Tabitha managed to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. She hesitantly said that the event should already begin, so everyone should sit down. Everyone was indeed distracted by the royal mage's inappropriate behavior, but Arthur knew that the man would not back down. Their eyes met and it became clear that he was still interested in this mana-beast, even without knowing that it was actually a dragon. Meanwhile, the auctioneer began his speech with a ceremonial greeting to the nobles and adventurers, noting that it was a great honor for all those present to be at the anniversary event. Despite the great significance of this day, he did not hide the fact that all the distinguished guests had gathered here for one single, most important reason. It was no secret that what attracted everyone most was the opportunity to obtain one of the rare and valuable items that had been in the possession of the House of Helstia all this time, in anticipation of the anniversary. Those present were delighted. They were happy in anticipation of the best auction of their lives. While the adventurers responded to the opening words of the auction with thunderous applause, the more reserved members of the nobility began to clap in support of the event. Before the event began, the auctioneer asked everyone present to face the south side of the hall. He asked everyone to join him in greeting several extremely important figures who had blessed them with their presence. Of course, he was pointing to the balcony of the private room from which the king and queen of Saipan could be seen. All those present greeted the guests of such incredible status with a low standing bow. The auctioneer himself, standing opposite the place where the royal family was seated, bowed to the ground. After greeting the heads of the kingdom, he smiled and offered to greet the one who was the man who made this event possible. At this point, everyone present dedicated their applause to Vincent Helstia, a man who was also on the southern balcony and took a few steps towards the railing, greeting those present. Being in the center of events was a familiar thing for Arthur, and he did not show any sign of embarrassment because it reminded him of his past life. Catching himself in this thought, he began to shake his head to the side, thinking that he was no longer a king and should focus on the current situation. He folded his hands in front of him and sighed heavily, because as a child who had not even reached puberty, he was still too limited in his ability to influence this world. Remembering the old days, he smuggled alcohol from the bar when no one was looking. In order not to attract unnecessary attention, he continued to be near Lilia and Ellie, who were entertaining themselves in their own ways, enjoying delicious ice cream. Mama Alice, Mistress Tabitha, and Queen Prinzilla went aside to discuss their women's affairs. At this moment, the observant Arthur managed to notice that there was a magic wand on the queen's belt, which indicated that she was a spellcaster. The fact that he couldn't sense her mana meant that she either wore a magical artifact to hide her powers or was at a high enough level. At that moment, when he looked closely at this beauty, their eyes suddenly met and Arthur became a little embarrassed, either from her attention or because she noticed the alcohol in his hands. Giving his glass to Sylvie, who was even younger than him, he wondered why he felt no attraction to the queen. This thought was probably due to the alcohol in his blood. He began to wonder why he was not interested in any older women, even if they were in the same age range as he was before he was reborn. Alternatively, he believed that it was because they were the same age as his mother. On the other hand, he also did not find young girls who were the same age as him attractive. This was most likely due to the fact that his body had not yet reached puberty. Based on this, he decided that it was unimportant at this point, and it would be better to return to this issue a little later. At the moment when Sylvie started to behave inappropriately due to alcohol, Arthur was distracted by Vincent, who said that a nice sword was going to be put up for auction as the next lot. He said that if Arthur wanted it, then he should let them know, so they could bid. Coming a little closer, he winked at him with a sly smile, saying that there was no need to worry about the price because the owner of the auction had privileges. After these words, a tray with the next item was wheeled towards the stage. As Vincent had said, it was a sword, and the auctioneer specified that it had been forged by a master blacksmith, who was also a master of fire. The handle of this weapon was constructed with the core of a mighty thunderhawk. What was even more surprising was that after the wielder infused a small amount of mana into it, it would cause electrical discharges on the edge of its blade, increasing its cutting ability and even inflicting a paralyzing effect. This item was the first thing that could interest Arthur. The fact that it was the right size and had magical properties seemed like a good advantage in a fight. Having explained the advantages of this lot, the auctioneer said that the bidding would start at 50 gold pieces. Despite the high price, there were many interested participants, and the price gradually began to increase. In turn, Arthur thought about the fact that a modest house in Zyros was worth at least 1 gold coin. Thinking about the unfairness of the price of this item, a drunken Arthur began to calculate that the average family in his hometown of Ashbur could easily live on a handful of copper coins a day, while the initial bid for this sword could provide a living for at least 5 families. Vincent, not understanding what was going on in the pensive young man's head, asked him what he thought about this sword. He immediately said that it was too big for the young man, but such a sword with such properties was quite difficult to obtain. In response, Arthur agreed that it was not bad, but refused. The young man justified this by saying that he did not need such an item, since he would rather have something less unique. Winking back at him, Vincent accepted his words as worthy of his talent, saying that there was no point in playing with the spark when you could control the lightning itself. Even though they hadn't managed to find the sword at this point, Vincent said that even if he didn't find anything he liked, all the other items had already been collected. Hearing this, Arthur was surprised that he had even found the voice-changing mask. His words hurt the pride of the auction house owner, and he replied that even the coat he bought him was made of nightmare fox, so it had the ability to hide its presence from prying eyes. He bragged that it was like a boy's wish. Arthur was very grateful, but he cheekily remarked that this was more like what he had hoped for. Vincent was not hurt by his words, for he knew how strong Arthur was in negotiations. He asked him to be careful in his adventurer's way, for he himself would suffer if he suffered. As for the continuation of the auction, Vincent was right when he said that the sword was just the beginning. There were many weapons and even several mana beast cores, ranging from C-class to A-class. The king himself even bet on several of them, winning an A-class core. However, even after spending 100 gold coins from the kingdom's treasury, only after a person successfully finished the process of absorbing the core would they know whether the core contained the beast's will. Although it was quite fun, Arthur began to get tired of the process and could not wait for a break. Suddenly, he noticed that Sylvie, who had been next to him all this time, had disappeared somewhere. Asking the girls if they had seen Sylvie, he learned that she had been with them just a few minutes ago. Arthur was alarmed by her sudden disappearance and began looking for her everywhere, even under the sofas. Suddenly, he heard her pitiful, frightened voice, with which she addressed him by telepathy. Looking around, he saw that she had been cornered by the magician, who had accompanied the king. This man with a terrifying aura and incredible curiosity tried to touch Sylvie, getting closer and closer to her. Sylvie, who had never been in such a situation, was very scared. Feeling her dad approaching, she jumped up and ran towards him. As Sylvie came closer, he asked her to walk beside him and turned around without further words, not meeting the man's gaze. He tried to keep his composure, knowing that he was dealing with the royal family's court magician. In response to his actions, the madman pointedly and roughly hit the floor with his cane. Rising to his feet, he said that a commoner from some backwater would have no place to develop with such a special beast. Hearing these impudent words, Arthur stopped and asked again what they were talking about. Having established contact with the young man, the magician began to smile disgustingly. He intended to provoke the boy from the very beginning, because he understood that he would achieve his goal at any cost. Looking at Arthur with a threatening gaze, the court magician arrogantly said that this mana beast would become his property. Hearing these insolent words from the disgusting guy, Arthur clenched his fist furiously. His eyes filled with rage and his mind instantly went cloudy. Showing off his murderous aura despite his young age, he asked the impudent man to repeat those words again with a menacing look and a cold tone of voice. A few minutes earlier, nothing foreshadowed this disaster. Vincent continued to watch the auction proceed, but he felt sorry that Arthur hadn't been able to find anything. He thought the boy simply wanted a good quality sword, nothing unusual or inherently strong that would attract unnecessary attention. He was sure that such an object would not be difficult to obtain, and Arthur would find himself a worthy blade when he visited their storage. He was distracted from his thoughts by a gentle touch on the shoulder. It was Mr. Blaine, and upon seeing him, Vincent said that he hoped he was enjoying the event. In response to his words, the king sincerely said that although he did not know how they managed to obtain the A-class silver-furred bear core, he was very pleased with his purchase. With a smile that was in anticipation of using the item, he said that he could only hope that the beast's will was still within the item. Vincent bowed respectfully and replied that he was glad that this modest event had pleased His Majesty. Patting him on the back, the king said with a friendly laugh that the only thing modest here was the organizer himself, because this event was simply of incredible proportions. However, just a moment later, their conversation was interrupted. They froze due to the piercing feeling of fear that spread, due to the powerful thirst for blood. Grabbing his heart, Vincent, who is not a magician, understood that this almost tangible thirst for blood was not even directed at him. But it did not allow him to stand on his feet. From such incredible pressure, he fell to his knees. The king, worried about his friend's well-being, shouted his name while his guards drew their swords from their sheaths and began to run in their direction. Vincent, clutching his neck from the feeling of suffocation, could not understand what was happening. He was sure that the auction house's security was top-notch. The royal guards immediately took their places around the royal faces, and Queen Priscilla, taking out her magic wand, asked not to worry about her and to protect the children. Mr. Blaine was ready for this challenge. He had an incredible artifact in the form of a ring, with which he could carry various objects with him. Thanks to this storage, he drew his sword in an instant. Having prepared for battle, he turned to the stranger who dared to attack the royal family and ordered him to show himself. The royal guard and Mistress Priscilla protected Tabitha, Alice, and their children. King Blaine and the rest of the knights stood up to protect Prince Curtis and Princess Caitlin. The only one of the royal retinue who was unable to fight was the court magician, who sat trembling on the floor, holding his magic staff in his hands. He was shaking in fear because of the powerful bloodlust of the one who had created this commotion. Arthur knew that he had done a great wrong for losing control of himself and causing real trouble for the royal family. As soon as he realized his mistake, he stopped using the overwhelming bloodlust, and the silence was interrupted by the cry of a frightened Ellie. A moment later, Vincent felt relieved, but still could not understand what had really happened. Then the front door to their private room opened with a bang and Ray, Adam, and Jasmine ran inside, anxiously asking if everything was okay. One of the royal knights answered the question. He assured that everything was fine, but specified that it was worth searching the room and checking the surrounding area. Without wasting any time, Mr. Ray gave orders to his comrades to check the surrounding area. The oppressive atmosphere returned to this place again. Arthur was very sorry that he had created such problems, but he could not admit that it was his doing. In turn, the court magician, who had disgraced himself in front of the child, could not reveal the true cause of the commotion. Sylvie was okay, but also worried about the situation, realizing that her dad had created a mess. Their silence was broken by one of the guards of this event, who informed His Majesty that Captain Lavin had detained an uninvited guest. This report was enough to calm King Blaine, who was worried about the situation. Even Arthur was surprised that such news satisfied him, and yet Arthur was grateful to this unexpected guest, for his sacrifice had not been in vain. The noise that had been foisted on this poor fellow must make him an object of torture. Luckily, Sebastian became the butt of the jokes. The royal knights couldn't understand how the royal court magician could fall on his ass because of a little intimidation from an intruder. When one of them said that he would lose his head, he furiously justified himself by saying that he slipped, while everyone present sighed heavily because the danger turned out to be a false alarm. Sebastian looked worriedly at the child who actually caused this commotion. A moment later, he looked away from the calm and stern young man out of anger at the fact that he had mocked him, with nothing more than a thirst for blood. Meanwhile, the auctioneer thanked the guardsmen for their service and announced the continuation of the show. Next to him was the last lot of this anniversary event, and he said that tradition demands that the best item be saved for last, and he himself is not one to neglect them. Solemnly presenting the last lot, he intriguingly asked who would be the lucky one who would be able to acquire such a wonderful treasure. A moment later, he showed off what had been left for the final auction, and everyone present saw a roaring child of the world lion. After showing this wonder that fascinated all the nobles and special guests, he gave a little information for those who do not know this magnificent man of beast. He said that an adult world lion has the ability to become a powerful assistant, and even reach a class. Looking around, Arthur, sternly observing the vile court magician, noticed that the hypocritical guy didn't even pay attention to the other man of beast. Continuing the presentation of the last lot, the auctioneer made it clear that this means that care and gentle treatment of this beautiful animal will allow its owner to mount a beast. Seeing his interest, the nobles began to laugh awkwardly, realizing that they had no place in this competition. Turning to Mr. Blaine, he said that the nobles were the most generous of all the nobles. The nobles were so generous that they even offered 1,000 gold coins for this incredible man of beast. The auctioneer was so impressed that he even asked the nobles to join the auction. The nobles were so generous that they even offered 1,000 gold coins for this incredible man of beast. Seeing his interest, the nobles began to laugh awkwardly, realizing that they had no place in this competition. Turning to Mr. Blaine, he said that the nobles were the most generous of all the nobles. The nobles were so generous that they even offered 1,000 gold coins for this incredible man of beast. After these words, he congratulated him in advance on winning the auction, saying that 1 plate of white gold would be more than enough. Thanking him for his attention and generosity, the auctioneer asked what the king's plans were for the new royal pet and whether he would tame it himself. In response, Blaine thoughtfully said that no matter how tempting it would be to have a relationship with it, he could not do it. In fact, he was thinking of giving this noble beast to his heir, Prince Curtis. As soon as the king said that everything depended on how much effort his son would put in, Curtis rose proudly from the sofa and resolutely said that he would do everything in his power to justify his father's wildest hopes. In response to his words, Mrs. Priscilla suddenly embarrassed her son, asking if his statement meant that she would no longer have to listen to the tutor tell her how he was skipping his magic classes. Watching this funny scene, Arthur thought with a smile that, looking at them like this, one could safely say that they seemed almost like a normal family. The auction was nearing its end, so Vincent asked the king if he wanted his items collected immediately and sent to their castle. In response, Blaine impatiently replied that he had no patience to wait, so he wanted to go down with him. Lord Helstia was pleased with the king's mood, so he happily offered to follow him. Before they went down to the warehouse, Sebastian distracted the king with a few words. He began to whisper something in the king's ear, but Arthur did not hear what was being said. After that, the king replied that he understood everything, and Sebastian looked at him with a sly, self-confident smile. Seeing this, Arthur noticed a bad feeling about this. Going down to the warehouse, Mr. Vincent said that a servant would soon arrive at this place with His Majesty's things. After that, he turned to Arthur and asked him to come closer. At that moment, another worker approached them, bringing some magical items. Vincent said that everything the young man asked for was here, except for the sword. Regarding the sword, he thought it would be better if Arthur looked around himself and tried to find something he liked. At that moment, his mother came up to him and said solicitously that she would hold his things while he looked for a sword. The king was surprised to hear the mention of a sword and assumed that Arthur was about to take fencing lessons. He said that his son had just begun learning too, and that perhaps one day they could have a friendly sparring. Arthur said that he should hurry because the king wanted to meet him in person. Seeing that Arthur would learn bad manners if he sparred with some country bumpkin, Arthur demonstrated an incredible level of upbringing when he said that for him, swords were just a hobby, and he could never even hope to reach such a level. Meanwhile, Ray appeared passing by the warehouse. He stopped as soon as he saw Vincent. Seeing his good friend, the head of the auction house said that he should hurry, because the king wanted to meet him in person. Seeing His Majesty before him, Ray bowed low and apologized for intruding on their time. In response, the king asked him to stand up and not to worry, saying that he had heard that he had caught the intruder. Based on this, he decided that Vincent had found himself a reliable assistant. Raising his head, the modest and well-mannered Ray said that he was not worthy of such praise from His Majesty because he was simply doing his duty. Pointing his hand at Arthur, King Blaine turned to Reynolds Laven and asked if this was indeed his son. Ray confirmed this and asked if anything had happened to disturb his master. In response, King Blaine explained that his mage Sebastian had been serving in the royal guard for many years, having helped their family countless times. For the excellent service he had given to him and their country, he felt the need to reward him from time to time. After these words, the king said that his protege really liked the mana beast that Arthur possessed. Hearing this, the young man realized what they had been talking about, and why that disgusting guy was looking at him with such a smile. Looking at the boy who was shocked by what was happening, the king said that if the Laven family provided the royal family with their son's mana beast, then they would be doing the kingdom a very great favor. King Satan's own words about his Valcourt mage Sebastian taking a liking to Arthur's mana beast put Ray in the most awkward position he could remember. Looking at his son, he wanted to know what he thought about it. It was clear from just one look that Arthur was devastated by the gravity of the situation and was not ready to let go of Sylvie, who also looked extremely confused. Ray, who didn't know how to respond in this situation, tried to answer something but couldn't find the right words. King Blaine, who thought the situation was under control, as he was very much trying to achieve his goal, thought that this was about the difficulties with this matter. So he said that he would be more than happy to compensate them for this mana beast, and hire a mage to break the contract with his son at their expense. Bowing again to His Highness, Ray said that he had to apologize to them. He lowered his head and said with great tension, an emotion that neither he nor his wife had anything to do with their son's mana beast, since he had received it himself, which is why they could not speak on his behalf on this matter. Alice, watching this difficult situation, had never seen anyone resist his will so much. Noticing this look for look, the king turned his attention to Arthur himself. He was not used to having dialogues with children because he understood that one should not expect reasonableness from them, and he understood, especially when it comes to a child not from a noble family. What was unusual was how cold and determined Arthur's gaze was, demonstrating with just one look that he denied such a possibility. King Blaine had never seen anyone resist his will so much. Noticing this look from the child, Sebastian became angry and shouted at Arthur why his parents didn't teach him to lower his eyes when he spoke to those who were higher in status than him. Greeting Arthur again and addressing him as a child, the king said that there was no need to repeat himself, for he had certainly heard the conversation with his father. He asked him what he thought of it, and mentioned that he certainly had a sword in his arsenal worthy of any young knight. Arthur lowered his head and thought that he should calm down, and stopped him. Understanding the boy's affection, Blaine asked him what himself that he was dealing with someone who was still the king of Sapin and had the greatest power among all people. Bowing respectfully, Arthur thanked His Majesty for his kind offer, then shocked everyone present with his polite refusal, saying that even the most magnificent sword would never replace Sylvie. Seeing this, Sebastian began to scream, but the king stopped him. Understanding the boy's affection, Blaine asked him what he thought about trading for the World Lion Cub. At that moment, Curtis said that he thought it belonged to him. Despite his son's words, the king did not back down, saying that reptiles rarely become as strong as true predators. To their surprise, Arthur coldly refused even this offer. He could barely contain himself, politely apologizing for not being able to clearly express the first time that he did not want to give away, sell, or exchange Sylvie, who was so dear to him. At this point, King Blaine, who always got what he wanted, could not stand it any longer. After remaining silent for a few seconds, he said more sternly that he had asked him for a favor twice, but he was not going to repeat it several more times. The king warned that his patience was running out, and then asked one last time if the youth would give up his mana beast. Arthur was already shaking with anger and angrily clenched his fists because the situation seemed hopeless. Suddenly, he calmed down and asked to be allowed to ask a dialogue with the king himself. Arthur said that the mana beast was already in his hands, while the king, surprised by such adult words from the lips of a child, froze in anticipation of that very question. What came out of Arthur's mouth shocked everyone present. He asked a horribly disrespectful question about how much King Blaine was willing to sell his children for. Raising his head, he began to speak calmly, as if he were equal in this dialogue with the king himself. Arthur said that the king had already asked him 3 times and was refused 3 times, which indicates that his pride does not allow him to accept his refusal. That was why, looking at His Majesty, he assumed that King Blaine simply did not realize the seriousness of what he was asking. Speaking of the hope that his question would clarify the situation, he asked again how much money the Glader King himself would demand in exchange for his son or daughter. The royal family, hearing such insolence towards them, was shocked because nothing like this had ever happened before. Even though they were friendly and talked to them as friends, they could hardly come to terms with what had happened. Vincent and the Levin family knew that Arthur had incurred the wrath of the king himself. They could not even imagine what would happen next. While the king stood in a stupor from such words from the mouth of a child, Sebastian looked towards one of the royal knights, who nodded in response. A moment later, the knight drew his sword and made a quick dash towards the youth, who was insolent towards the king, shouting that the boy was an uncouth country bumpkin. He nervously asked how he dared insult the king and his family. Arthur did not turn around, and Sylvie, who looked in the direction of the attacker who swung his heavy sword high, completely trusted her dad. Looking at the blade that was moving towards him, Arthur was surprised that the royal knight was concentrating all of his mana into his sword, meaning that he was going to cut a normal child in half right in front of the royal family and his parents. Seeing the knight's pathetic attempt, Arthur decided to remain calm and keep the flow of mana calm and steady to easily avoid this blow. Controlling his feelings, he made a small movement back at the last moment, losing only a few hairs. Anticipating his opponent's movement, he took control of the trajectory of his strike. With a loud clang, the knight's sword became stuck in the tile, while Arthur dodged the blow without any problem. Holding his opponent's arm, Arthur brought the knight's balance to an end, then gathered mana in his right fist to strike. With a huge whistle, he sent a blow towards him, aiming to smash the opponent, using both his strength and his own momentum against him. A furious blow, with all the conditions for a successful counterattack met, destroyed the royal knight's helmet and threw it aside. The blow was so strong that even the royal knight could not withstand it, and instantly lost consciousness in front of everyone. The royal mage who started this conflict was furious that the knight had missed a great chance. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Sebastian began to use his cane, thinking that even if he was punished, he would take matters into his own hands. He could not leave empty-handed, because the king did not understand that a mana beast capable of forming an equal contract at such an age would be beyond Class A. Anticipating success in obtaining such a rare mana beast, the vile court mage aimed one of his powerful spells at the child who had just struck the royal knight. At this point Arthur had not yet managed to even raise his head, although he felt that magic was directed at him. Ray and Alice, scared that their child was going to be killed by the court magician, rushed towards him, but it was too late. However, in the midst of this chaos, time suddenly stopped. For everyone except Sebastian and Arthur. Mr. and Mrs. Helstia, who were afraid for Arthur's life, as well as Alice, did not even notice how time stopped for them. Ray, who wanted to protect his child with all his might, moved towards him but suddenly froze. The same thing applied to the king and queen, who were shocked by what was happening. The prince and princess were horrified to realize that members of their guard had raised their weapons against the impudent youth of their age. Ellie, frightened by this commotion, threw herself into Lilia's arms. While everyone in the room froze in place, Sebastian and Arthur were able to continue their fight. The court mage, who had cast a spell on his opponent, was surprised to see his magic suddenly dissipate. Arthur, who had just sent one of the king's knights to sleep, began to rise to his feet. Sebastian, who thought there was something wrong with his staff, did not yet understand what was really going on. The youth sternly replied that his attempts to attack were useless, as spells that required surrounding mana to be cast would not work. For the two of them, time really stood still. The young man's gaze became cold and threatening, so much so that the magician began to tremble with fear. As soon as Arthur raised his head and showed his eyes, in addition to his murderous aura, a marking similar to the one Sylvia had appeared under his eyes. The court magician, who was frightened by the boy's strength, began waving his trembling hands and panickingly saying that he should not approach, because he was pathetic if he thought that he was a worthy opponent for the royal family's magic caster. In just a moment Arthur launched an attack with incredible speed, appearing behind his opponent. He coldly replied that even in this state, he was still stronger than some arrogant mage from Saipan. Sebastian was shocked that this young man was able to suddenly appear behind him. Within a moment, he felt a terrible pain coming from his broken right leg. In a split second, Arthur launched an attack that turned his bones into sand. Falling to the ground, Sebastian began to scream hysterically in pain. Looking around, he, not understanding what was happening, began to panic and ask why everyone was just standing there and no one was helping him. However, no one heard him. There were only the two of them here. Putting his hand on the nasty guy's shoulder, Arthur sat down next to him and told him that his screams were useless. He advised the poor guy to listen to him while he still had the strength to do. The night was one of the last things those present saw before the strange turn of events. Said in a frightened, trembling voice that no one could do this to King Saipan's own personal spellcaster. After these words, Arthur let go of his shoulder and stood up. He took a few steps forward, then put his hands in his pockets and said that in a sense, he was right. Taking one last look at the vile guy, he said with the overwhelming aura he inherited from Sylvia, that the bastard should know his place. Arthur's blow to the knight was one of the last things those present saw before the strange turn of events. King Blaine and Queen Priscilla were shocked by what happened. Although His Majesty did not want the child to suffer at the hands of his guards, he did not blame the guard for attacking him after such words. Still, he could not understand how this commoner child managed to defeat the knight. It seemed to him that his guard had tripped, or something. A moment later, he heard a sharp whistle followed by the sound of something falling behind him. Looking around, the king was shocked because it turned out that Arthur had suddenly moved to another place and was unconscious. Lily also did not understand what had happened because her friend instantly appeared in another place. However, looking in his direction, she was horrified by what she saw next to her. Not far from Arthur, the court magician who had earlier tried to attack the young man with his spell was lying on the ground. For some unknown reason to those present, he ended up on the ground with a broken leg. Seeing this cruel picture, Lilia hugged Ellie even tighter and began to scream in fear. Neither Mr. Vincent nor his wife, Tabitha, understood what had happened. Ray and Alice were no less frightened. Everyone just froze in place. Even Sylvie couldn't understand what had really happened. Sebastian sat trembling on the floor trying to hold on to his leg, which was turned the other way. Tears and snot were streaming down his face, and through the unbearable pain, he barely clearly asked for help. King Blaine, who saw something like this for the first time, was so shocked that he could not utter a word. He could not even imagine that his royal gang would be killed after his battle. In the end, the conflict ended at this moment in the court magician Sebastian, who now looked pitiful. The knights were about to finish their comrade's work, but Queen Priscilla, who was hugging her frightened daughter, shouted for them to stop messing around and quickly examine Sebastian, and also immediately bring a healing mage to this place. At this point, Arthur lay unconscious on the floor and did not know what was happening after his battle. In the end, the conflict ended at this moment incomprehensible to those present. Sebastian and the knight who had been hit in the face by the child were carried away on a stretcher to the infirmary. While the doctors were busy with the royal guards, Ray and Sylvie rushed to Arthur. Lifting his son from the ground, the father made sure that his heart was beating and his life was not in danger. They didn't understand what had happened, but they were horrified by how dangerous the situation was. Ray and Alice all woke up in bed. When he woke up, he didn't understand what was happening or where he was. He went over to his wife. Alice tried to heal her son with trembling hands, but it was still not easy for her. After a few seconds, her magical radiation stopped, and tears appeared on her face. As before, she couldn't use her skills in this situation. Vincent and Tabitha were speechless, and they themselves were horrified by what had happened between Arthur and the royal family. In the dark hours of the day, Arthur woke up in bed. When he woke up, he didn't understand what was happening or where he was. The first thing he realized was that he had a severe headache. Looking around, he recognized his room in the Hestia family mansion, which was already good news, and yet he did not remember how he ended up here. The last thing he remembered from those events in the auction house warehouse was that he had definitely used the static void. Clutching his head, which had been hurting so much since that incident, he realized that he had overdone it. Thanks to Sylvia, he can use static void ever since he reached the phase of acquiring her dragon's will. This ability allows him to temporarily separate himself from the flow of time, allowing him to turn the tide of battle in his favor, and is only available to him because he's Sylvia's successor. Arthur began training this power while he was still in Eleanor. After returning home, he continued to increase his control, so his time in the static void gradually increased. But this came at a high price, because despite years of training, he was only able to use this ability for a few seconds without feeling the same strong impact as he did now. Ultimately, Arthur exceeded his time limit when he used static void on another person for the first time in his life. He sighed heavily and fell back onto the bed to continue resting. All things considered, he hopes he's lucky that it only ended with him falling unconscious. At that moment, he heard footsteps outside the door and a gentle female voice addressing Sylvia. Sylvia, who couldn't stand still and wait for the moment when she would go inside, immediately felt that her dad had regained consciousness. She brought Alice with her, and immediately rushed towards Arthur. With a surprised look, the mother said that her son had finally woken up. After that, she sat down and hugged him. After which, with tears in her eyes, she repeated the doctor's words that he most likely lost consciousness from shock and would soon wake up. Alice was not pleased with herself for once again overreacting and crying when it turned out that her son was fine. She also remembered to mention that the doctor had called his recovery an emergency, which was inappropriate since it had been almost 8 hours. After listening to her words, Arthur felt quite sad because of the guilt that he had made his mother worry again. At that moment, he was suddenly interrupted by a sharp pain in his head. Noticing her son's wince, Alice fearfully removed her hand from his head and worriedly said that he looked as if he was in pain. Arthur replied that it was nonsense, after which he asked what happened after he lost consciousness. Alice lowered her head and remembered that no one was in their right minds back then, especially the children. So the king and his family apologized and left the Helstia auction house. She then mentioned that his father was in the living room with the king's representative, and they were discussing what had happened. Hearing this, Arthur stood up and said that he wanted to see how they were doing down there. In response, Alice said that she wanted to visit Ellie and just in case, spend the night in her room. When she asked again if everything was okay, Arthur replied with a sweet smile that she shouldn't worry and that she could calmly rest a little after these disturbing events. To stop her from worrying so much, Arthur asked Sylvie to go with her mother to Ellie. As Arthur walked down the stairs to the living room, he began to hear his father talking to the king's representative. Ray was trying to defend their interests, saying that this was not something that could be compensated for with money. It was about the situation, and Arthur's father was shocked that his son had almost been killed in the chaos. Even though the conversation was in full swing, Arthur still decided to join in. Seeing him, Reynolds was very glad that he had finally woken up. Scratching the back of his head, Arthur walked inside and said that he felt fine, after which he asked what was going on. Ray, standing next to his son for whom he was so worried, explained with displeasure that the king's representative had simply thrown in a few coins as a token of apology from His Highness for that so-called little incident. Putting the tea aside, the king's representative stood up and said that he was glad to see Arthur Lavin in good health. He introduced himself as Jasper Cograte and said that he was there on behalf of His Majesty to offer his deepest condolences for what had happened that morning. As he offered his condolences, he pointed to a bag of gold on the table. Despite the attempt at manipulation, Arthur did not act like a child and responded with status, not paying attention to the money. Sitting down opposite the guest, he decided to simply play the scene in the role of a humble victim. Looking at Jasper, he thanked him for having come all this way. Although Jasper had heard that the boy was a commoner, he was surprised to find that he had good manners despite his age. He went on to mention that he had told his father most of what had happened, but he wanted to let him know that both of the men who had attacked him had been removed. Hearing these words again, Ray asked to clarify whether the king had really slapped them and simply waved goodbye for almost killing his son. In response to his words, Jasper sternly replied that it was Arthur who had spoken carelessly and had caused the consequences. After these words, the tension in the room increased and they both stared at each other, not wanting to give in to this verbal skirmish. This was a good moment to play his cards. Arthur relaxed the situation by saying that everything was fine and Mr. Cogwright was right in a way, since he was also out of sorts. He also pointed out that he was not hurt, so they should just get it over with, without arguing. Returning to his humble appearance again, Arthur asked what had happened to the magician whose knee had been broken. In response to his interest, Jasper informed him that the court mage Sebastian had been removed from his post and that his injury from the battle was currently still being treated. Still being secretive, Arthur asked if they had been able to determine what exactly had happened to his leg. He was very worried about being a suspect in this case. Jasper responded that when Sebastian woke up, he was adamant that Arthur was the one who caused the injury. In response to this absurd statement, Ray furiously shouted that it was simply impossible. Seeing his shock at these words, Jasper interrupted him with an accented cough and asked to be allowed to finish. He explained that although that was what he had said, they believed, based on the remaining mana in his staff, that the knight's mana had interfered with Sebastian's spell. Arthur's mouth dropped open in surprise that it had all ended so easily. He couldn't believe that they had actually taken such a possibility seriously. After discussing the details, Mr. Jasper left the mansion and walked towards his carriage. As soon as he left, Ray threw into his son's hands the bag of gold that the king himself had given as an apology. Arthur was surprised, so his father explained that he deserved the money, because he almost died in a situation in which his parents were powerless. He also noted that he would need money when he began his adventure. He then advised him to go to bed and rest a little, for which Arthur thanked him with a kind smile and said that he really appreciated his concern. As Arthur started to walk to his room, his father stopped him for a few more words. He thrust his fist forward and proudly said that that punch was damn good. This compliment, which he could not hear in his past life, made the boy feel incredibly good. He reciprocated his feelings by thrusting his fist back. Returning to the room, he hid his money for the future. Fortunately, the situation with Sebastian was resolved without any problems or consequences. In addition, he was still able to obtain all the necessary items for the adventurer career, except for the sword. Although the danger was over, it made him all too aware of the adventurer. To discuss the matter, Arthur and his father went to a local pub, Power, or Equal Treatment. Taking the cloak and mask in his hands, Arthur thought that everything would be different once he began his journey as an adventurer. In his hands was an object that could temporarily erase his limitations as a child. With the voice-altering mask, he could relax a little and act as he wished. The promised 3 months flew by quickly, and after the recent events at the auction house, it was time to think about how to become an adventurer. To discuss the matter, Arthur and his father went to a local pub. In this cheerful and noisy establishment, they met with friends from the team of adventurers of the Twin Horns. Ray, as the former captain of this wonderful team, had not previously mentioned his plans to find a guard for his son, who was about to go on an adventure. Having told them what they had planned, he asked who could become a support for the young and promising magician. Adam was the first to respond to his proposal, but he spoke of refusal, since he was not yet ready for such an undertaking. He explained this by saying that babysitting children is not his strong point. Moreover, it is not clear whether he was joking or not. He clarified that it will not be easy to work with a character like Arthur's, because if he doesn't like something, he can even kill him in his sleep. Imagining this situation, everyone started playing along with him, saying that this could really happen and that his words made sense. Adam's awkward excuse didn't bother Arthur at all, and in response, he just laughed sincerely, since he hadn't even counted on his company. Looking at the rest of the group, Ray admitted that he had actually hoped that Durden or Helen would accompany Arthur. Seeing their reaction, he admitted a little sheepishly that they couldn't really offer a decent reward, but that he and Alice were more than willing to compensate them with whatever they could if they did such a favor for them. In response, the kind big guy said that Ray shouldn't behave like that, because everyone sitting at this table was like one family, and he himself would be happy to accompany Arthur and watch him grow right before his eyes. Helen supported Durden's words, saying that he was right, so Ray should know that they wouldn't do this for money. She also pointed out that they had managed to get quite a bit of treasure from their last dungeon raid, so money wasn't an issue. Although it seemed that even the captain of the current team of twins was ready to go with Arthur, one girl, whom Ray had not yet mentioned, firmly proposed her candidacy. This statement was sudden and attracted the attention of everyone sitting at the table. Jasmine, who had always been quiet and reserved, showed a special interest in something for the first time. Angela was surprised by her words, remembering that she hated escort missions even more than Adam did, who had immediately refused the offer. Without further ado, Jasmine replied that this time everything was fine, because the task was to accompany not just anyone but Arthur. Hearing her words, Helen took it upon herself to say that Jasmine was the most suitable person to protect Arthur. When talking about Durden, she said that he specializes mainly in defensive spells, with a huge area of effect, making him a good member of large teams, but not two fighters. After that, she frankly admitted that defense was not really her strong point despite her excellent ranged combat skills. Putting her hand on her heart, Alice, surprised by Jasmine's words, asked if she was sure that she could cope with this difficult task. In response, Jasmine showed unprecedented determination and gave a thumbs up, indicating that she was truly serious about this task. Raising a spear and looking at it, she said that she was not going to mind traveling in Arthur's company, but there was no point in creating a team. She said that she should be trusted since she is the only amplifier among them that has an elemental affinity. Also, he said that she broke through to the light orange stage last year, so with her wind attribute, she is probably the best fit for this mission. Durden agreed with his words. With his usual sincere and kind smile, the big man said that he was sorry, because he didn't mind traveling in Arthur's company, but there was no point in creating a team of 3 when there was such a reliable person as Jasmine. His sincerity was highly valued among the team. Ray, who knew him as a very good person, approached him and put his hand on his shoulder, saying that he would still be lucky enough to work with Arthur on the same team. Everything was decided, so Arthur said with a kind smile that he would be glad to be under Jasmine's supervision. In response, the cute girl with red eyes looked at him with a smile, thinking that their adventures would be exciting. Having resolved this issue, the guys continued to celebrate their reunion in the pub until the evening. After a long day, the Levin family finally returned home. When they entered the mansion, the first thing they saw was Lilia, who was distracted from her work by the creaking of the door. Seeing her practicing, Ellie began to be indignant that doing it without her was not fair. The whole family began to laugh at her emotionality and acting, and Arthur was glad that Lilia was already able to meditate on her own, without his help. On the other hand, he thought that Ellie should be able to awaken at the age of 7 or 9, if she really had the patience to meditate. Still, he thought it might be for the best that she didn't awaken too early, since she would be getting a lot of attention. Seeing that everything was fine and Lilia and Ellie could now train on their own, he happily asked his dad if they could go to the auction house. He reminded him that he still needed to find the sword, but last time he failed to do so because of that unexpected, unpleasant situation. The father was only too happy to help him and spend some more time together, while the mother, who looked genuinely happy, asked them not to stay too long, as she would soon be preparing dinner. Lilia's father and mother were already waiting for them at the auction house, where they had a lot of work to do after the anniversary event. It was the first time he had seen them both since that incident, so he was faced with a long line of questions from them regarding his well-being. Arthur tried his best to reassure them that he was fine and that he was happy it was over, but they were extremely unhappy with the king's behavior regarding the incident. Vincent and Ray found support in each other, agreeing that firing the two jerks was just a temporary measure until things cooled down. They figured it wouldn't be long before they got their positions back and the incident would be forgotten. Fortunately, this incident was not made public, and only 2 parties to the conflict knew about it. Interrupting Vincent and his father's heated discussion, the young man reminded them that they had come to this place because he needed to find a sword before he could go take the test to join the Adventurers Guild. His reminder worked perfectly and the guys were distracted from the discussion. Vincent led Arthur to their warehouse and told him that it might take him a while to find something he liked. Despite this, he assured him that he could take his time with his choice, since his access to the warehouse was unlimited. When Arthur walked inside, he complimented Mr. Vincent with his reaction to what he saw. In front of him appeared a simply enormous room, in which things for future auctions were arranged quite neatly. There were 2 whole floors here, and it was obvious that these items were carefully looked after. Among the various artifacts, the most worthy swords that immediately caught the eye were those that were located on special shelves. Besides the swords, there were also some incredible bows that had never been shown at auction before. On the second floor, there were even more weapons. There were incredible spears and swords worthy of the best knights. Seeing such a huge number of things, Arthur was inspired by such a possibility. However, his violent reaction did not last long. The task proved impossible when he set about it. There were so many different types of swords, but none of what he was looking for. As expected, it was not easy in a child's body, because the length and balance of the weapon were designed for adults. After looking at the weapons used in this world, he guessed that because most of the warriors in this world were enhancers, there were so many huge swords with one-handed and two-handed grips. Such a weapon was not suitable for him, as it would severely limit his potential as a mage, forcing him to rely only on enhancement and brute force. His search for a reliable sword that he could use with his small frame bore little fruit. In addition to swords, he encountered many other interesting items here, such as unique shurikens that can be used for medium range. He was tempted to give up and perhaps find a more unique weapon in the meantime. Taking the nunchaku in his hands, he felt like a real ninja, but he understood that using such an impractical weapon would be too stupid for him. Suddenly, he was distracted by the squeal of Sylvie, who seemed happy. It seemed that she had found something interesting when she began rustling under the cloth that covered part of the inventory of this warehouse. Throwing the funny nunchucks aside, Arthur came closer and asked if she had found anything useful. After a small rumble, Sylvie pulled out some strange object. It resembled a stick, and there was a joyful expression on her face. Looking at this strange object, Arthur replied that the stick was not quite what he was looking for. Although he didn't know what she wanted with this stick, he decided to take a closer look. As soon as he grabbed the object, he felt that the stick was quite heavy. He was surprised to realize that the balance of this stick was the same as if it were a sword. Seeing the place that most likely separated the hilt from the scabbard, he began to try to get this sword, but he did not succeed. Arthur was surprised by this and assumed that he needed to fill it with his mana to use it. Using the mana aura, he took a stance and put in even more effort, but still didn't achieve any results. Continuing to try to draw the sword from its sheath, he only wasted his strength. Testing his theory using mana, he even tested all the elements at his disposal, but the sword remained in its sheath. Tired of trying in vain, Arthur threw the sword to the ground. Sylvie, who knew there was a sword hidden inside, was a little disappointed that they had no way to get it. Arthur knew that the problem was with the seal, which prevented him from accessing the sword itself. It became obvious that it was not the specific element that allowed the sword to be used, but he did not know what else could affect this scabbard. At that moment, as he stood leaning on his knees, he felt his seal that he had received from Sylvie begin to react to the sword. Even though he was hiding her aura, he could still feel the sword reacting to his hidden power. To test his theory, he concentrated on his beast will. Within a moment, the powers he had inherited from Sylvie awakened within him. Taking the sword in his hands, he immediately heard a click, and the hilt separated from the scabbard without much effort. The blade of this mysterious sword was truly mesmerizing. It glowed turquoise and was translucent. Having taken out the weapon completely, he was surprised because he had never seen anything like it before. Looking at the translucent turquoise blade of the sword, he couldn't even think about how beautiful this weapon was. Even too beautiful to be considered the same sword as the ones he had held in his hands before. Even though he stopped using the dragon's will, he could still hold it in his hands. This weapon seemed more convenient than all previous options. However, even despite this, he still experienced difficulties. As before, he continued to stumble due to the difficulty of using adult swords. The sword and the scabbard itself were too heavy for him to use them with maximum effectiveness at that age. Simply swinging weapons was boring, and there were no suitable training items in this warehouse. Apologizing to Vincent in advance, he lunged towards the barrel and made a chopping blow, but was unable to achieve the desired result. The sword was indeed sharp, but Arthur still could not count on demonstrating his true strength. Raising the blade of the sword up, the guy began to examine it. A moment later, he noticed an interesting detail. On the part of the blade next to the handle was the name of this blade. It was a ballad about the dawn, made by a mysterious master with the initials VK. Within a moment, the sword began to release its own aura, and a cut appeared on Arthur's palm. The sword fell from his hand as Sylvie began to squeal in alarm. Arthur reassured her that he was fine and the wound was not deep. He didn't understand why this suddenly happened. However, looking at the sword that was lying on the ground, he noticed that the blood that had gotten on the hilt had suddenly evaporated. The sword's behavior seemed strange, but Arthur still decided to take it into his hands again. When he looked at the sword again, he was shocked that it had suddenly changed. The weight and balance of the sword seemed completely different. It was now simply perfect to use. After making a few swings, he was convinced of this in practice. He had never held a more comfortable sword than this one before. Moreover, not only the handle, but also the length of the blade itself has changed to better suit the child's body. Since he had already managed to ruin one barrel, he decided that nothing bad would happen if he continued testing the weapon on it. As he made the leap, he knew he now had access to a fine weapon. He had held priceless swords in his hands for decades, but he had never felt as good as he did at that moment. In just an instant, he made an incredibly fast cut using his full potential. The barrel on which he tested the sword showed results only after a few seconds, and its upper part began to slowly slide down, after which it fell to the ground. Arthur heard the sound, but wanted to make sure that everything happened as he planned. Looking back, he was surprised at how good his attack had been. As a result of this blow, he was able to achieve a clean cut on the first try. He never thought he would find such a treasure by chance. Although extremely rare, there were cases where skilled craftsmen were able to create staffs and wands that had the ability to bind themselves to only one person. Basically, they themselves had the will to adapt to their master, improving the circulation of mana between them. It made sense, but Arthur had never read of any instances of a sword possessing such a power. He was very curious to know who the mysterious master really was, who had created such a masterpiece. He spent quite a lot of time in this place. So after a few hours, Vincent and his father visited him. They had already finished their business, so their father said that it was time for them to return home. Arthur was rushed, so he asked for one more minute. At that moment, he ran to the rack of swords and grabbed one nondescript sword that didn't seem like a bad option. As he started to walk towards his father, Sylvie began to scold him for his bad behavior and for hiding the truth again. And yet, she knew perfectly well that they had not visited this storage in vain, because they had chosen an incredible object. Arthur winked at her, saying that she was right when she suggested that he take a closer look at the strange stick. As he approached Vincent and his father, he saw their joy that he had found something he liked. Holding the nondescript sword out towards them, he let them examine it, saying that it was not as fancy as some of the other swords, but he knew it was what he needed. Arthur said he knew it was right after he'd swung it a few times. Picking it up, Ray asked Vincent what he knew about it. The auction house owner replied that it had been auctioned off several times at a small stall, but hadn't sold. Taking the blade out of its sheath, Ray decided to check whether it really was not worthy of the buyer's attention. After making a few swings, he checked its balance and weight. After that, Vincent asked him what he thought about his son's choice. Looking at the blade again, Ray replied that he could tell that the weight distribution seemed somehow off, as the creator was trying to make it a light sword for quick attacks. Returning the blade to its sheath, he nevertheless noted that it was not so bad. Moreover, he specified that for Arthur's size, this sword would be better suited than the others. As he returned the sword to its new owner, Ray noticed a stick on his belt. He asked what it was. Noticing the stick on the boy's belt, Vincent became interested in this object. The situation became awkward because Arthur did not want to draw attention to his real choice. Trying to act carefree and calm, he replied that he tripped over it on the way back. Showing off the incredible sword as an ordinary stick, he said that it was strong and heavy, so it would be a good tool for training, as well as training Sylvia. Vincent couldn't really remember such an item in their inventory, so he asked to take a closer look at it. Taking the strange stick in his hands, he asked his ward if there were any records of such a cane. Jameson, looking at the notes, replied that one of their traders had mentioned a rather strange story about some decrepit old man who had simply thrown it at him, muttering that no one was worthy. Speaking about this mysterious cane, Jameson also said that they had previously asked several inspectors to check it out just in case. They thought that it just seemed like a sturdy cane, but in fact, a more qualified craftsman would be needed to evaluate it. Seeing that the auction house actually saw some potential in it, Arthur decided to intervene in the conversation. He turned to Vincent with a sweet, hopeful look, calling him uncle, and said that it would be nice to have such an item during adventures. His plea worked, even though Ray knew it was a pure provocation. Under pressure from the young man, Vincent gave him the mysterious cane, saying that he had nothing to regret, because it was just gathering dust in their warehouse. The trip to the warehouse ended in success for Arthur, and Vincent was amazed that he was so sweetly called uncle. Arthur had completed all the preparations to become an adventurer. Finally, a very important day of his life came. His 9th birthday. All the people dear to him, the Levin family, the Helstia family, and even all the fighters of the Twin Horns adventurer team gathered for this celebration. He was incredibly happy to have their company, and in response to their congratulations, thanked them for all of them putting up with him for another year. The modesty of the young man touched everyone who had gathered there. Alice said with a sweet smile that she could not believe that their beloved son was already 9 years old. Understanding what she was getting at, Vincent clapped his hands and asked her to put off their sweet memories until after their little celebration. After he clapped his hands, the mansion's employees came out onto the lawn where they were celebrating the birthday with carts full of goodies. This holiday was carefully planned, because for Helstia, art became part of their family. Even Sylvie was delighted with how many incredible dishes were prepared for this birthday. Laughter and pleasant conversations brightened the day. The many delicious dishes that filled the table could satisfy the taste of any of the guests. Tabitha, who saw some hesitation among the guests, cheerfully urged them to begin eating. The boys had a great time enjoying the peace of these ordinary moments in life. After drinking enough alcohol, it was time for funny stories. Adam, who was trying to somehow offend his comrades with their ridiculous moments from the lives of adventurers, suggested remembering the time when Durden's pants caught fire, and he had to return to the city covering his naked ass. Remembering this awkward moment, the kind healthy man covered his face and sheepishly asked to stop this story. Noticing this insolence, Jasmine asked Adam not to relax. After these words, she said that since he was telling other people's stories with such a laugh, then he must have forgotten how a horned mole had crept right under him when he was doing his business in the dungeon. The funniest part of this story was that at that moment he got so scared, jumped up, landed on his back and wet himself like a fountain. Having told this awkward story, Jasmine caused loud laughter from everyone present, and the previously self-confident Adam began to feel embarrassed and, in his defense, shouted that he thought that everyone was asleep then and no one saw it. Arthur was delighted with this kind of pastime. They hadn't had so much fun for a long time. He appreciated every moment of such a life, as Granny Sylvia asked him to. When it became cool outside, they returned inside the mansion, where a warm fireplace was already waiting for them in the living room. When everyone got inside, Ray said that since they had finished dinner and completely humiliated Adam, it was time to move on to gifts. His words caused laughter again, and Helen, who was the current team leader, tried to calm the hot-tempered guy who felt awkward. The first gift Arthur received was from his family. He sat on a separate sofa, where Ellie climbed onto, because she wanted to open that gift with him. As he removed the lid of the box, he felt the magic emanating from the gift. When he saw what his family had given him, he was simply delighted. In front of him was a magical glove. His mother said it was made from the skin of a spiked aurochs that Ray hunted. She had embedded a small healing spell into each of the 3 stones on it. The spell in each stone could only be used once, but it was a great thing. Looking at the gift that his parents had made with their own hands, Arthur thanked them for their care and said with delight that this glove was beautiful. Hugging his parents, he emotionally said that he liked her and that he was very grateful for what they did for him. When the touching moment came to an end, Vincent coughed pointedly into his fist and announced that he was next. After these words, he knelt down in front of the young man and opened a box with 2 rings. Art played along with him because it looked like his uncle was proposing to him. The moment was funny, but his wife and daughter clearly didn't like it. So Tabitha slapped him on the back of the head and asked him to stop teasing the boy. Vincent, who was saddened by such a reaction to his joke, replied that he didn't think that no one here had a love for such a performance. Returning to this gift, he took out 1 ring and handed it to Arthur himself. He gave the second ring to his mother. Tabitha explained that while Arthur wore his ring, the gem on his mother's ring would sparkle if his mana dropped to a critical level. She said there was little they could do, but even that would give her some peace of mind for her son's future journey. Alice was very grateful for this gift. She threw herself into the arms of her best friend with tears of happiness. Turning to Vincent and Lilia, she thanked them too for making such a wonderful choice. Ray was also glad that Alice would now be much calmer during their son's journey. Only Arthur understood that this ring, despite its usefulness, was more like a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it could free his family from constant worry, but at the same time, it could keep her in a constant state of tension, expecting trouble. Worse, he did not rule out the possibility that he would one day find himself in a battle where he would have to fight at the limit of his capabilities. When the first 2 gifts were presented, Adam looked at his comrades and asked how they could overcome something like this. With a kind smile, he turned to Alice and Arthur, saying that since he was already so damn strong, they thought along the same lines as the Helstia family, and so they decided that the little monster needed something unique. After these words, Durden handed Arthur a mysterious scroll. As it turned out, there was also a second part of the gift, intended for Alice. These were the communication scrolls, and Adam said he wouldn't go into detail about how expensive they were. When he pointed out that they were indeed damn expensive, he got a smack in the ass from Jasmine for ruining such a beautiful moment. Back on topic, he concluded that the Levin family now had a disposable communication source that they felt would fit perfectly with their new rings. When it came to the instructions, he explained that Arthur simply had to pour mana into the scroll to write a message that would reach Alice despite the distance. In turn, once Mom receives the message, she will be able to respond to it only once. After confirming that the message was given to Arthur, both scrolls will turn to ashes. When the detailed story came to an end, Ray emotionally supported Adam, saying that it was very spectacular and amazing. In the end, the gifts he received on his birthday turned out to be very significant for his career as an adventurer. The parents knew he had a big day tomorrow, so they were excited. Hugging her child, Alice asked him to promise that he would be safe. By kissing him on the forehead, she demonstrated her tenderness and motherly care, which her son appreciated so much. With tears of happiness in her eyes, she wished him to remain safe and sound. With a kind smile, he replied that he would return home at every opportunity. This wonderful day has ended, and the time has come to say goodbye. The adventurers from the Twin Horns team wished him luck on his upcoming journey and boarded the carriage. The last to say goodbye was Jasmine, with whom he would have to share the difficult path of an adventurer. This birthday was very significant for Arthur, and he knew that he would remember it for the rest of his life. Moreover, such events made him understand something important. He had felt this way for some time, but after returning home when he fell asleep, he knew that it was true. Now he had a real family, people who loved him. It was a feeling he would never give up. Joyful Arthur thought that he would cherish this feeling and fight for it if necessary. To do this, he needed to become stronger, even stronger than when he was a king. The next morning started off very cheerfully. True, it was fun for Arthur, but not for Sylvie. He wanted to take a shower, but Sylvie was not yet used to it, and was very afraid of water. She didn't want to take a bath so much that she tried to hold on to the tiles using mana enhancement. Arthur was hurt by how much she resisted, shouting that she asked for it. He mercilessly strengthened his body with magic to finally pull her into the bath. The real dragon and the dragons there began to fight. Sylvie, tears in her eyes, tore herself away from the surface and began to squeal, evoking pity. But Arthur had prepared her for life to be cruel. When he tore off her surfaces, he threw her straight into the water. Sylvie was very offended by him and looked at him as if he were a traitor. In response, Arthur teased her, letting her know that there was nothing wrong with it. His beast daughter's acting was top-notch. However, this did not save her because, being subject to the forces of gravity, she fell into the water like a stone. Having finished this torment, Arthur quickly got ready and left his room. He was equipped with everything he had prepared for his upcoming career as an adventurer. Even though he was forced to leave his family for a while, he had a smile on his face because he knew he had no other choice. The parents and Ellie were already at the exit. Sitting down next to him, Ray said that his son already looked like a real S-class adventurer. Before saying goodbye, he gave him some advice, saying that although they both knew he was very strong, he should not become overconfident and forget his limits. Speaking of hard times, he asked him to rely on Jasmine. Then Ellie ran up to him and started crying, asking if his brother and Sylvie were really leaving them. There were genuine tears on her face because she had fallen in love with him very much during the time they spent together. In a trembling voice, she asked if they could stay instead of leaving. Seeing this touching scene, Alice could not contain her emotions. She covered her face so that the children would not see her tears. Ray couldn't say anything at that moment, but he was definitely happy with how wonderful their children were. Sitting down next to her daughter, Alice tried to console her, saying that Sylvie and her brother would be back before she knew it. Despite her words, Ellie continued to rant, saying that she wanted them to stay to be here right now. Only her charming little brother could influence this situation. Taking her hand tenderly, he said that since she was already a big girl, he had a very important task for her. With a kind smile, he asked if she could protect Mom and Dad while he and Sylvie traveled. Throwing herself into his arms, Ellie couldn't hold back her tears. She began to speak decisively to justify her brother's hopes. She went on to say that she had trained a lot, and now she had many little lights, thanks to which she would be able to protect her mom and dad. As Arthur hugged her before leaving the house, he thought that he had missed so much of his sister's life that he couldn't help but agree that he would have been better off staying. He knew that his short stay here was not enough, but in order to protect them all in the future, he was forced to take this decisive step forward. When he looked at his mother one last time, she hugged him and said with tears in her eyes that everything would be okay with them. Ray joined his wife's words, saying that he could not worry about them. While the mother said goodbye to her son, Ellie said goodbye to Sylvie, who was already suffocating in her arms. Wiping away her tears, Alice asked him not to forget to put on the ring. With a kind smile, Arthur showed his palm and it was clear that it was already on. As he approached the door, he heard the last words, accompanying him on his way. Father said that they will always root for him. In response, he nodded his head to them because he knew perfectly well that this was so. When the door closed, his mother, father, and sister continued to watch him go. As soon as he left, Alice started crying and Ray began to calm her down. Outside, a carriage was already waiting for him, as was Jasmine. First of all, she asked if he was ready for the adventures of an adventurer. Before answering, Arthur reached for the backpack containing the things he had taken with him. Putting a mask on his face, he answered in a changed voice that he was ready. The guys first went to the Adventurers Guild. The building was quite spacious, and inside there were many who had long dedicated their lives to such adventures. Here people not only received licenses and work, but also looked for a team to make work easier. When they got inside, Sylvie was woken up by the noise inside and started yawning. Looking at Sylvie, Jasmine was surprised and noticed that Arthur's mana beast looked a little different. Stroking Sylvie's head, Arthur replied that he had recently discovered that she could change her appearance slightly to look exactly like a black lizard without drawing too much attention to herself. Having waited for their turn, they approached the administration window. A nice lady in a blue shirt welcomed them to the Xyrus Adventurers Guild and asked how she could help them. As Arthur tried to answer, he was suddenly interrupted by Jasmine. She abruptly placed the document on the counter and said that she would like to sponsor this recruit for his rank exam. The lady working in the guild was surprised by her words. Still, she knew what the procedure was in case of sponsorship. Hearing this, she dropped the counter and went outside. After that, she asked Jasmine and Arthur to follow them. As she escorted them, she said that they actually had a lot of people wanting to take the exam. But since there was a sponsor present, they would place them closer to the front of the line, so that they wouldn't have to wait so long. Then they went to the side of the room that was guarded by the local guards. Arthur wasn't used to the way adventurers were. As he passed the crowd, he began to hear them gossiping about his short stature. Seeing how distracted he was, Jasmine asked him to hurry up. The lady from the guild reception went to the center. As they entered, she informed him that A-class adventurer Jasmine Flamesworth had wished to sponsor the recruit standing next to them for the rank exam. The manager, dropping his work, rose from his desk and told his charge that she could wait outside, as he was well acquainted with Miss Flamesworth. Arthur was surprised that Jasmine knew such an important person. When he looked at her, she looked away because this topic was very painful for her. As soon as the manager asked how she was doing and mentioned his meeting with her father, she nervously clenched her fist, and it became clear that she was not on the best terms with her family. Caspian Blayhart, the man in charge of this branch of the guild, turned out to be quite the cunning manipulator, who for some reason decided to remind her of her problems. Returning to the topic of the new recruit, he mentioned that there would usually be an application that had to be filled out along with a mana core test before a series of practical exams. After this, he, emphasizing Jasmine's status, said that since Miss Flamesworth was his sponsor, then he did not mind skipping these formalities. Seeing Jasmine's discomfort, Art wondered if her family was really that special. He felt very sorry that she had to take advantage of her status, which she could not stand. Taking a look at the curious new recruit, Caspian said that the only thing left for him to do was to take part in a training fight with one of their examiners. After assessing his weapon, he assumed that the recruit was either a fighter or an enhancer. Since it wasn't a question, he trusted his feelings and continued to go over the rules, saying that names weren't required to register as an adventurer. Extending his hand towards him, he explained that since he was on intimate terms with Miss Flamesworth, he would like to know how to address him. The question was pointed, but the answer was right at hand. Having received this mask, which hid his true voice, Arthur noticed an interesting engraving. She reminded him of part of a musical note. Shaking the hand of the arrogant and overly proud Caspian, Arthur asked to be called by his name, Noda. As soon as their hands touched, they felt the resonance of their mana. Both of them became interested because they recognized each other's strength. When they left his office, the manager led them into the corridor and said that it was a pleasure to meet such a mysterious man. Turning to Mary, he asked her to show his dear guest to the examination hall. Taking a few steps forward, Arthur looked around. He was not mistaken in thinking that he had interested the leader of the guild, Xyrus. Caspian really did follow him with his eyes, because he was interested in what kind of power this man with the mask possessed. As they walked down the hallway, following Mary, Arthur reflected on the fact that the Flamesworth house had been mentioned with a fair amount of respect. He even wondered, given that, if that was why Jasmine had wanted to accompany him. On the other hand, he noticed that she seemed very upset about the mention of her father. Despite her obviously conflicted relationship with her family, she was still not averse to using such an advantage to achieve her goal. When they reached the end of the corridor, they saw a door in front of them, and Mary said that this path would lead them to the arena where the exam was being held. As she let them go ahead, she asked them to be careful as they climbed the stairs. and to find a place and wait until the recruit's name was called. The location where the final stage of the adventure exam took place was in the backyard. Walking out into the street, Arthur heard a loud scream. There was a small arena here where battles between examiners and students took place. The fierce fighter who wanted to immediately obtain a high rank of fighter tried with all his might to at least touch the examiner. He seemed to be quite good with a spear, his movements were fast, and his attacks were quite strong. But the examiner dodged them without much difficulty, and didn't even see the point in blocking these attacks. Despite the fact that many blows did not bring results, the fighter did not lose his spirit, and confidently noted that his opponent was very good at dodging. With a determined look, he lunged for another attack, asking if the examiner could dodge the next blow as well. The bald guy made it clear that he was going to show something truly outstanding, but his opponent's face showed that he was bored. As he walked up the stairs to his seat, Arthur kept an eye on what was happening in the arena. As he charged forward, the bald fighter, with a cloak on his back that strengthened his spear with a fire element, shouted that this was his hellish strike. Watching this, Arthur felt a little awkward because of the poor guy's behavior, as he did not understand why he was talking about his next move. Just as spellcasters recite spells to better visualize the image in their minds, many boosters have also chosen to vocalize the name of their attacks. However, this bald guy failed to surprise his opponent. Although George really decided not to dodge this blow, he instead simply knocked the weapon out of the adventurer candidate's hands, ending this ridiculous battle. After seeing part of that battle, Arthur wondered where such strange masters came from. It seemed to him that such a simple move as the guy was hoping for needed no name. Once on the ground, the boy who failed the final test asked in confusion how this could have happened. In response, the examiner made a thoughtful appearance, as if it was difficult for him to find the reason for such a sudden failure of the bald man. A moment later, he said with disappointment that there were grandmothers who could swing their canes better than this guy with his six-pack. Continuing the list of reasons why the poor guy failed the final exam, he made it known that he relied too much on physical strength compared to his body's enhancement with mana, thus upsetting the balance of his attacks, which were already laughably predictable. With tears in his eyes, the 35-year-old man, who was only in the deep orange stage, began to whine as he recalled that he had completed his workouts of 100 push-ups, 100 squats, and 100 crunches. Hearing the words of the loser who tried to become Saitama, George covered his face with his hand. Returning to the question of assessing his abilities, he said that he usually put someone of his caliber in the E-class. Since we are talking about fighters and not Mercedes cars, the E-class was a very disappointing result. However, given that he has an affinity with fire, the examiner gave him a small gift. Moving closer, he slapped him across the face, sticking a piece of paper to it. After that, he congratulated the loser on acquiring a D-class. As this world, Saitama left the arena with a sad expression. One of the guild representatives challenged the next fighter named Diana Whitehall to the exam. The pompous girl magician began to descend the stairs, saying that she should not be rushed. When she said there was no need to rush her, she was damn right. A moment later, she stumbled and began to fly down. Like a log, she fell face down onto the surface. When her dress went up, she made everyone laugh with her granny panties, but only those whose turn had not yet come laughed. They could afford such impudence because they had not yet been humiliated by the examiner. While some guys started laughing at the poor guy, there were also those who started getting angry. The arrogant young mage with the rather interesting cane complained that she should have been given an E-class just because of her clumsiness. He was furious that she was wasting his time. Arthur, who was analyzing those present, noticed this impudent young man. Looking at it, he noticed that there was a large amount of mana simply seething inside it. Their eyes met, and Arthur immediately realized that the guy was quite strong. Meanwhile, the clumsy Diana descended into the arena and took her place. After she fell down the stairs, her confidence was a little diminished. However, closing her eyes, she resolutely introduced herself as Diana Whitehall. She was only 18 years old, and her core stage was already at a solid orange level. She noted that she had an affinity for water. The examiner who approached her after these words noted that she did not need to introduce herself, since they already had all the information regarding their skills. She then asked the participant to prepare her weapon and also let her know that they had medical personnel and an emitter in case any injuries were sustained during the exam. It was the first time Arthur had been around mages like him, so he kept a close eye on everything. Once a caster reaches the orange stage, it becomes clear which element they have a high affinity with. Rather than trying to become adept at all four elements, it would be much more effective to focus solely on the one with which they have a high affinity. He had heard that for cultivators who claim to have a high level of affinity with two or more elements, the examination would be stricter to ensure that the applicants were truly telling the truth. Knowing this, he still could not reveal all of his elemental affinities. The final stage for the clumsy Diana began. Her examiner suggested to see how a girl with an affinity with water is in action. Releasing magic, the guild representative made it clear that she has an affinity with earth magic. As usually happened in such exams, Diana was the first to show her strength. She started the battle by casting a spell. She waved her wand and released mana and began to use water magic. As befits a mage, she began not with an offensive spell, but with a defensive one, causing a barrier of water to appear around her. Seeing Arthur watching with interest, Jasmine explained that since spellcasters were not as skilled at enhancing their bodies with mana as boosters, they were trained to take defensive measures first during battle. Despite the fact that the subject had only managed to prepare for the battle, the examiner decided not to let her relax and directed a sandstorm at her. This attack easily broke through Diana's barrier without any particular difficulty. It seemed like she was about to be defeated by the earth's magic. Arthur, watching this, found this move interesting. He decided that the examiner used this spell to limit Diana's vision in her protective sphere of water, because if she wanted to end the fight right away, she would have used a sharper form. Yet Diana managed to complete the task and disperse the earth using the release of water magic. She decided to speed up the pace of the battle by taking the initiative. Using the surrounding mana, she created even more water that concentrated around her. Unlike Pact was followed by a loud explosion, but nothing could be seen obvious as expected from a mage of her age. Using a spear made of water, she aimed it at the examiner, who didn't even use a defensive spell. Having dodged this attack, the owner of the affinity with the earth continued to watch the girl, but already felt some disappointment. However, at the same moment when the spear from the water appeared next to the examiner, Diana used the second stage of the attack. Her spear suddenly exploded and the area around the examiner was completely filled with water. It wasn't a second form of attack. Most likely she was using a diversionary technique. The spectators could not see what was happening in the arena because a thick fog appeared in front of them. Having limited the enemy's field of vision, Diana began another attack. The battle was becoming more interesting. When she collected the balls of water above her, she immediately directed them with a strike across the area to the place where the examiner had previously been. The powerful impact was followed by a loud explosion, but nothing could be seen due to the distracting fog that had been used earlier. Once the fog and dust cleared, it became clear that the examiner had disappeared and a hole had appeared in her place. At this point, it became obvious that the examiner had taken advantage of the situation to move. When Diana felt her behind her, she realized that her performance was already over. After giving the poor guy a didactic blow on the head, the examiner said in a kind tone that she had to admit that her control level was quite decent and that the last sequence of spells had been well practiced. She noted that despite this, Diana was a little overconfident. The obvious mistake was that she had not prepared another defensive measure to prevent an outcome similar to the one that ended her trial. However, overall, the examiner acknowledged that her mana control and spell preparation speed were good, which is why Diana received AC class. This girl showed more interesting skills than the poor guy who looked like Saitama. Moreover, Arthur knew that AC class at her age was something she should definitely be proud of. As Diana left the arena, the guild representative began to call out the name of the next test subject, but suddenly stopped to double-check what was written on the paper. It seemed that this was a good venturer from the very beginning. Arthur was also interested in who the mysterious man was who was the one who was tested. Arthur noticed that this time the person who was to undergo the test was different from all the previous ones. To sort out this issue, an even more experienced examiner approached them. After looking at the paper, the amplifier who had tested the first candidate turned to the next fighter and said that he had been informed of his situation. Everyone present was simply shocked when they learned that a certain new recruit had been given the title of B-class adventurer from the very beginning. Arthur was also interested in who the mysterious man was who had achieved such a high rank without even taking the exam. One of those present in the waiting area suddenly stood up. He was opposite where Arthur and Jasmine were. the one who was able to immediately get a B class. Without the final test turned out to be an unremarkable, rather young guy in glasses and ordinary clothes. As soon as he raised his head, his green eyes immediately turned to an equally interesting young man. At that moment, Arthur and the mysterious recruit remembered each other. The next candidate for adventure was Lucas Weeks. As it turned out, it was that same arrogant magician. The boy, who must have belonged to a noble family, was very bold even in conversations with the examiners. Because when he went downstairs, he asked the lady why she didn't just let him go ahead, assigning him an A class. After his bold words, the lady began to read his file. Lucas Weeks, who was only 11 years old, was already in the light orange stage and had an affinity with one element fire. Arthur was very surprised when he heard that this 11-year-old boy turned out to be such a rare monster. Despite his talent, he was arrogant and insolent, yawning right in front of the examiner. His demonstrative disrespect was probably due to his noble birth. But the strange thing was that his appearance was very similar to that of an elf, despite his mastery of fire. The arrogance of this guy drove the examiner crazy. Moreover, the impudent young man continued to behave in this manner, and even showed a cheek. Surrounding himself with fire, he demonstratively struck the ground with his cane. After his behavior, the examiner, at the limit of her patience, suggested that they begin. After these words, they took their places. The young man's sly grin began to show even some of the malice that was inside him. Swinging his magic cane, Lucas began to use the fire element. From the very beginning, his flow of magic was astonishingly powerful, and he did not use speech to cast spells. Surrounding himself with fire, he demonstratively struck the ground with his cane. After this, he spoke words calling for his protector to rise up. From that moment on, the silhouette of a tall monster made of fire appeared behind him. This was his protective spell. Watching his first steps in the test, the examiner who tested the amplifiers noticed that Lucas had a stable and also decently sized flame guard. Together with another representative of the guild, they came to the conclusion that they had a particularly gifted young man. In a surprising move, Lucas sent his fire guardian to attack. With a wicked look and a threatening tone, he cast the following spell, commanding the created guardian to burn the enemy to ashes. In response to his spell, the examiner, with a calm smile and a superior intonation, said that she was surprised that the young man from the Wykes house did not simply fill this monster with hot air. Even though she acknowledged the power of his magic, she still wasn't going to budge. Trying to put the impudent man in his place, she clarified that his disrespect showed that he needed to learn restraint. After these words, several pillars of earth began to rise directly from the surface surrounding this monster. All these pillars suddenly united, locking the fire guard in an earthen coffin. Watching the battle, Arthur admitted that it was a very good move on the part of the examiner because the flame guardian would naturally be extinguished once it used up the oxygen that was inside this coffin. Despite the success of his opponent's defense, Lucas was still arrogant because he had already managed to prepare his next move. Saying that it was too late, he directed dozens of fire spheres at her. Even more impudent was his mention of rumors that there had never been a case of an examiner being injured while assessing new adventurers. Unheard of was his impudence in saying that he would do her the honor of being the first to suffer at the hands of a candidate. The way this boy was so arrogant really made Mrs. Emily angry. Using earth magic, she began to stop the spheres that were flying towards her from the sky. However, despite her control, Lucas thought of this in advance and, making a dash towards her, he carried out an explosion of the remaining spheres with the help of a spell. The entire arena was filled with explosions, and Miss Emily, who did not have time to defend herself with an earth spell, was forced to dodge, moving to a safer place. In just a moment, she was behind Lucas and a new earth magic spell began to grow around him. An earthen hand. Fireballs were heading, covering his face with his hands. Noticing her only at the last moment, Lucas only managed to fight her off with the help of fire magic concentrated on the end of his cane. However, as soon as he repelled the frontal attack, the examiner grabbed his leg with the help of the ground. As soon as he was captured, his fire spells began to lose their direction, and Lucas himself was left hanging in the air. Suddenly, he was transported to the location where his fireballs were heading. Covering his face with his hands, the previously arrogant young man began to scream in panic to be let go. Opening his eyes, a frightened Lucas saw that everything had already stopped. At the last moment, he was saved by the examiner. Miss Emily used an earthen shield to stop the fireballs that were aimed at their caster. Releasing control of her magic, she let go of Lucas and he fell to the ground. Thanking him for taking the time to watch this performance, Miss Emily, who was about to leave the arena, assessed his mana reserves and ability to cast high-level fire affinity spells, noting his potential. However, as soon as she started talking about his shortcomings and weaknesses, Lucas, who was lying on the ground, began to furiously shout that the exam was not over yet. In just a moment, a fiery whirlwind appeared around Miss Emily and began to close in on her body. Using magic after the battle, like a rat, he was going to inflict terrible injuries on her. Luckily, there was another examiner next to them. Being a worthy amplifier, George, using only his sword, easily dispelled the bastard's magic and freed Lady Emily. Arrogant Lucas was incredibly angry with his behavior and began to accuse him of interfering with his exam. Sheathing his sword, the examiner, not understanding the audacity of this young man from a noble family, replied that he was the one who broke the rules and suddenly used the spell despite the end of the exam. Continuing to spout nonsense, Lucas screamed that the witch he was fighting was the one who got in the range of his next attack, blocking those fire beams. He began to prove that she was the one who considered the exam over, even though he had everything under control. Despite Lucas's slander, the calm examiner replied that he could feel free to complain, even though it was pointless. Emily only sighed heavily, seeing how arrogantly the young man from a large family behaved. When her colleague asked for his result to be announced, she once again said the words regarding how his mana reserves and magic control were excellent, and despite the shortcomings that came from his lack of experience, she decided that it was more than reasonable to assign him a B class. As expected, the result was incredible despite his shitty behavior. Everyone in the arena was silent, knowing that they couldn't beat his performance. Despite the fact that he received a very high rank for his age, Lucas was unhappy and, as he climbed to his place, punched the walls. Saitama, who wanted to support him and become friends, said that he was doing well, after which he congratulated him on getting a B class. Turning around nervously, Lucas said angrily that they shouldn't even try to compare themselves to him. Returning to his seat, he continued to harbor anger towards the examiners, muttering that they would have a hard time when the time came, when his father heard how meanly his examination had been interrupted. Arthur watched the behavior of this impudent guy, realizing that he would be a very problematic adventurer. Suddenly, Jasmine distracted him, smiling as she extended her fist towards him and wished him luck. The next to speak was none other than Noda. As he descended the stairs, he thought about how he could best approach a warrior of his examiner's ilk. Seeing him in action, he had no doubt that he had years of training and experience with the sword. And he also didn't miss the fact that his movements were fast and precise, although his defense was not without gaps. Snatching the folder of papers from his colleague's hands, the usually disgruntled examiner asked Noda to hurry up, saying that they could not spend the whole day on this event. As Arthur walked into the arena and nodded his head respectfully, George read that he was being tested under special conditions, which is why they had no information about him. Seeing that he had a blade on his belt, this enhancer type examiner began to take out his blade, deciding that he would be a suitable opponent to find out what this mysterious masked guy was made of. However, a moment later he froze in place, experiencing sudden pressure from the recruit. He couldn't even imagine that something like this was possible. Looking at Note, he felt the confidence and incredible strength of his movements. This guy's aura was truly overwhelming. Cold sweat began to appear on the examiner's face. For the first time, he felt fear in front of the candidate for adventurer. Their battle was interrupted by the master manager of the Xyrus Guild. The examiner, who was alarmed by the enemy's overwhelming aura, was glad to be distracted from this battle that hadn't even started. Arthur immediately recognized who the voice belonged to and asked them to stop. It seems Emily and the guy who helped them with the final exam were surprised by what their boss was doing. Taking off his jacket, Caspin asked the examiner to leave the arena. Taking a few steps forward, the manager declared that he would be the one to evaluate the examinee named Note. This was the first time something like this had happened since the creation of this team of guild representatives. When the manager himself stated that he would personally evaluate the candidate, George was a little taken aback. Apologizing in advance for the rudeness of his words, he said that there was no need for a Class A master to stoop to evaluating the exam, especially for a mage of his caliber. Suddenly thinking that it had something to do with his reaction to pressure from the candidate, George justified himself by saying that if the manager's decision was due to his indecisiveness, then it was worth noting that he was simply considering how much force to use during the attack. Caspian knew perfectly well that neither George nor Emily would be able to adequately assess the mysterious guy who was so confident in his battle with the blade having a strong core. Putting a hand on his colleague's shoulder, he said that he did not doubt his abilities. He explained his decision by saying that he felt obliged to evaluate Noda personally, seeing the connection between him and his sponsor. After he had made this false excuse, he asked with a calm but at the same time arrogant look if this would be a problem. None of the current examiners could even utter a word against the decision of the guild manager himself, who is an excellent fighter. Based on this, it was obvious that he would be the one to take this exam. Everyone present was even more interested in this battle than the one that took place between Emily and Lucas. Arthur had known from the start that this Caspian was one of the biggest gaps in his defense. In fact, even an experienced fighter like him appreciated each other's strength, recognizing it as worthy. Now Arthur knew for sure that the person standing in front of him was not only the head of the Adventurers Guild branch in Saipan, but was also an A-class adventurer himself. When Caspian took out his blade and pointed it towards Arthur, he immediately began to analyze it, and was amazed at the difference between him and the previous examiner. This man had no obvious gaps in his defense. In fact, even an experienced fighter like Arthur could not find his weakness. And the pressure caused by his bloodlust was enormous, as if he was not going to conduct the exam as usual. Having felt the enemy's intentions on himself, Arthur smiled in anticipation for the first time at the sight of the enemy. Gripping his not very comfortable sword even tighter, he couldn't stop enjoying his feelings. For the first time, he was filled with the excitement of anticipating a truly worthy battle. As before, the self-confident and slightly arrogant Caspian said that the subject should prepare for battle and not take their special attitude towards his personality to heart. Instead of saying anything extra, Arthur, who also pointed his sword towards the enemy, simply nodded his head in agreement. What was surprising about this exam was that this time, the examiner himself started the battle. Within a moment, Caspian demonstrated incredible speed, and was next to Arthur, striking him. Arthur blocked his blow with difficulty, and when Caspian pushed him away, he was unable to stay on his feet at all and fell to the ground. Despite the disadvantageous position of the candidate for adventurer, Caspian did not intend to ease up on the pressure and again swung for a strong blow. His blow was precise and fast, without unnecessary movements, but Arthur managed to jump away from the place of his blow and do a somersault. As soon as Arthur tried to strike back, Caspian instantly disappeared from sight, and the enemy's mana began to be felt from his back. At that very moment, the guy felt the wispy speed. Caspian barely had time to do anything. Only thanks to his increase, forcing the subject to fight at the peak of his abilities. Feeling the enemy's blow, Arthur, who did not have time to block the blow, decided to use even more mana to grip the surface. Dodging the blow, he made a small dash towards his opponent and found himself directly underneath him, in a position convenient for a chopping blow. Using the momentum of his body, Arthur directed his blow at his opponent with incredible speed. Caspian barely had time to do anything. Only thanks to his incredible speed was he able to push off the surface and jump to a safe distance, avoiding the deadly blow of the amazing candidate. Although he avoided the blow, the tip of his nose began to bleed from the slight contact with his opponent's blade. Caspian felt an incredible rush of excitement as he wiped his face. Taking his fighting stance again, he excitedly said that it was simply excellent. A moment later, they made another dash towards each other. Caspian was about to deliver a straight thrust while Arthur swung hard, not revealing his true intentions. Using the large radius of his swing, Arthur blocked his opponent's attack instead of striking. After he stopped his opponent, he swung his sword again to throw him back and upset his balance. Now the initiative passed into his hands. He tried to take advantage of his superior stance and made a quick attack with his sword, but the enemy miraculously managed to dodge. Dodging another lightning-fast attack, Caspian decided to counterattack, using a thrusting attack again. At this point, Arthur was in an awkward position and barely managed to dodge the blow that was aimed at his face. A shallow cut was left just below his ear, which evened out the number of injuries inflicted in this fight. The battle continued at even greater speed, and the enemy continued to press Arthur with his superior maneuverability, constantly appearing in a different place. Caspian carried out sudden attacks, among which were even blows with the hilt, which took into account its closer distance to the subject's body. Having taken a blow to the back, Arthur still did not lose his head and manage to regain a stable position. The pressure from the enemy did not decrease for a second. As they fought, Arthur began to realize what his shortcomings were. It became obvious that his muscles were underdeveloped, and he was more than a foot shorter than he had been accustomed to in his prime. Despite the fact that the initiative had passed to Caspian, he still continued to play, gradually bringing the enemy to a higher level of battle. He was overjoyed when he was convinced that the mysterious cannon was no longer useful. Despite how experienced his opponent was, Arthur could at least stand up to him in a fair fight. As he launched another attack, he once again began to exert significant pressure with his speed, which Noda had already begun to get used to. As he continued to dodge countless blows from the experienced opponent, Arthur came to the conclusion that even though his body was stronger, due to the assimilation of Sylvia's dragon will, it was still not enough against the veteran fighter, whose body was strengthened and clad in dense mana. Despite how experienced his opponent was, Arthur continued to resist and even carried out worthy counterattacks. Having parried another blow, Caspian admitted that by using their potential in this way, they could fight endlessly. He then jumped back to a safe distance and again, extending his blade forward, said that he must apologize for underestimating a truly worthy candidate, showing his affinity with the wind element, which was beginning to show through the behavior of his mana aura. Caspian sweetly said that he would become a little more serious now. However, as soon as he said this, Arthur felt a shiver run through his entire body, realizing that his words sounded like bait. At that moment, his body started screaming at him to run away. Taking a special stance, Caspian took a special step forward and, using wind magic, delivered a stabbing blow without even closing the distance. At that moment, Arthur realized that what he was going to use were long-range attacks. The powerful wind bullet fired from his opponent's stabbing blade had already pierced the wall that surrounded this arena in an instant. As Arthur narrowly dodged the blow, Caspian prepared his next instant spell and said that he was now certain that Miss Flamesworth had chosen someone worthy of the glory of their family. Continuing to move along the unpredictable minibus, Arthur only at the last moment noticed how another deadly attack began to approach his head. Throwing his head back, he managed to save his life in a split second. As Arthur dodged these crazy attacks, he came to the conclusion that while Caspian's wind bullets were fast and nearly invisible, they had one weakness, and that was that their trajectory was predictable. Having mastered the speed of the enemy, while simultaneously observing his movements, Arthur was able to adapt and even block the enemy's attacks. He had no choice but to make the task more difficult by closing the distance with his opponent. Although this would reduce the time he had to react to attacks, in return, he could gain at least a small but real chance of success. As soon as Arthur got closer to the enemy, he began to use less powerful but more frequent attacks. Finally, within striking range, Arthur revealed his trump card. When he began to use the fire element on his blade, Emily and George, who had already been watching this battle with admiration, were genuinely surprised. Jasmine expected nothing less from such a brilliant boy, while Sylvie was delighted, realizing that her dad was beginning to demonstrate his true strength. Having parried another attack with the blade, whose aura had acquired the fire element, Arthur even forced his opponent to jump back. Caspian had no doubt that a guy with such a magical core was a magician, but was pleasantly surprised to learn that he had an affinity for fire. Arthur's tactic was to keep the pressure on his opponent with endless close-range attacks, preventing him from making dangerous long-range attacks. Caspian, who was far more experienced with magic than he, accepted his challenge in crossers. He had never doubted his obvious superiority before. However, now that the mysterious man expected result, the power of their magic began to exert enormous pressure on the arena, creating a powerful vortex. Looking at the boy who came to the Adventurers Guild for the first time, the manager of the guild thought that the outcome of their battle should have been obvious. As an A-class adventurer who could use long-range spells that would kill most boosters, he had never doubted his obvious superiority before. However, now that the mysterious man named Noda had countered several of his moves with such high-quality countermeasures, he was starting to get nervous. The heat of this battle began to get to him. Caspian, who had previously been calm and cool, showed his fiery temper for the first time, shouting that he shouldn't be so arrogant. At that moment, Arthur felt his opponent begin to use even more wind magic to suppress his fire. He swung his sword furiously and sent a powerful stream of wind spell towards Arthur. Seeing Arthur unable to stay on his feet and flying to the side, Jasmine jumped up, shouting his nickname. Note! Moment Arthur, using the aura of mana and the flow of fire magic, and Caspian began to cast wind bullets of even greater power again. Arthur barely managed to dodge this attack, because after Caspian threw him back, he did not even have time to regain his balance. At that moment, he realized that the guild master he was fighting had begun to regard their fight as a battle of honor, and not a test of a new recruit. Caspian had indeed lost his temper, and the next attack was just as deadly and terrifyingly fast. At the last moment, Arthur, using the aura of mana and the flow of fire magic, managed to push off from the surface. It was only because he was in the air that he managed to avoid being seriously injured by a wind bullet. While in the air, Arthur did not lose his footing. Venturer class fighting Caspian, he had to go too far, revealing some of his utility and danger of staying at a distance that was convenient for the enemy to carry out his long-range attacks. He again began to reduce the distance in order to take the initiative in the battle. As he landed on the ground, he was a little dissatisfied with the way his exam was going. If he had fought his previous examiner, the battle would have been over by now, and he would have received a decent adventurer class. Fighting Caspian, he had to go too far, revealing some of his skills. Despite how dangerous and inadequate Mr. Bladeheart's techniques were, he still managed to speak in the middle of the fight, complimenting that Noda's abilities were truly impressive. After saying these words, he once again launched a wind bullet attack that was aimed at Arthur's face. The speed of his attack increased again, and Arthur did not have time to parry it. Moreover, he was in an awkward position for maneuvering. The only option that could give him a chance to dodge was to fall on his back, speeding up this process by using mana on the muscles of his legs. Having dodged, concentrating fire elemental magic on his blade and feet, Arthur accepted his challenge. Caspian took advantage of the opportunity without hesitation and rushed into the attack, having strengthened his blade with dense wind magic in advance. Despite the incredible pressure, Arthur managed to avoid his attack by jumping to the side. It was obvious that the manager of the Xyrus Adventurers Guild was constantly pushing the test subject to play more of his cards. Concentrating fire elemental magic on his blade and feet, Arthur accepted his challenge, for it was no longer his adventurer class that was at stake, but his life. With a quick dash forward, Arthur once again demonstrated the explosive step with which he had previously been able to maneuver in the air. Caspian had witnessed the use of this unusual spell before, the first time it had been used by a wizard with an affinity for fire. However, when the blade coated in fire magic approaching his body, Caspian began to lose his composure with his opponent and grab him by the arm. As it turned out, the spell that Arthur himself had devised was best demonstrated to be powerful only when used continuously, over and over again. Having revealed another card that gave him an incredible advantage, Arthur decided not to waste the opportunity and directed his blow with a fiery blade at the immobilized enemy. Seeing the blade coated in fire magic approaching his body, Caspian began to lose his composure at the thought that he was going to accept defeat while acting as an examiner for a candidate adventurer. Within a moment he began to scream furiously, losing his composure. At that moment he released a huge amount of magic in the form of wind. This powerful whirlwind stopped Arthur's attack and threw him to another part of the arena. Everyone around them could barely stand on their feet to the other side of the arena, managing to stop by using magic to improve his grip on the surface. He had a large amount of mana during the adventurer candidate test. A powerful stream of windy magic spread to the rows of spectators. This power made ordinary adventurers tremble, while it was of particular interest to the stronger ones. Lucas, covering his face, couldn't believe that the manager would release such a spell in response to the attacks of some masked weirdo. Arthur found himself back on the other side of the arena, managing to stop by using magic to improve his grip on the surface. However, as soon as he regained his stability, he felt another mortal threat. There were many currents of wind in the air, sharp as a blade. Landing on the ground, Caspian, who had earlier flown up from the powerful release of his magic, continued to cast spells for a most dangerous attack. The vortexes created by his power were directed at Arthur, whose fire could hardly withstand such pressure. Although such behavior, Arthur, who was in an incredibly dangerous situation, was not going to give up even at this. Continued to look at his target, which made him doubt his superiority. The situation was extremely dangerous. Jasmine, not knowing Arthur's true limits, feared that the fight had gone too far. Shouting the nickname of the young man she was supposed to protect, she jumped to the edge of the spectator area and took out her twin blades to intervene in the duel. However, Arthur, who was in an incredibly dangerous situation, was not going to give up even at this moment. He knew that he had reached the limit of his fire element, so he was forced to once again demonstrate another skill that would help him overcome this test. By training, studying, and using the lightning element, he tested the general theory of the two directions in the lightning school. As is known, there is external and internal magic. The A-class adventurer's mad wind vortex. Hoping for this, he found a foothold under his feet. In mastering internal magic, it was generally accepted among these mana users that it was not worth paying attention to due to the slight increase in strength, but Arthur did not agree with this. With his increased speed and reflexes enhanced by the internal use of lightning magic that accelerated nerve impulses, Arthur expected that he would be able to dodge all of the attacks from the A-class adventurer's mad wind vortex. Hoping for this, he found a foothold under his feet and prepared for a quick dash towards the enemy. However, a moment later, he felt his opponent's magic suddenly dissipate. Looking at Caspian in surprise, he saw him put his dagger back in its sheath. With a heavy sigh, the manager of the Xyrus Adventurers Guild asked to accept his apology for getting a little carried away in trying to find out the candidate's limits. They're slightly shocked. They still couldn't recover from this battle because there were real magic monster perceptive man. He said that given the fact that Noda had been so persistent in hiding his abilities until the very end, it was logical to assume that he wanted to be given a low rank. Arthur awkwardly scratched his mask, showing surprise that his plan had actually been discovered. Hearing the decision to promote Note B to adventurer level, everyone present was slightly shocked. They still couldn't recover from this battle because there were real magic monsters in the arena. Hearing about this result, the mysterious guy in simple clothes and glasses on his face, who was given a B rank without a test, was even more interested in the man named Noda. But Lucas, who was consumed by his pride, felt furious at being on the same level as them. After these words, Caspian began to slowly walk towards the exit of the arena, and the guild manager was the last one. After which George announced the end of the final stage, and Caspian glanced towards the new adventurer, asking if there was any problem with whether the guild's decision was fair or not. In response, Arthur nodded without hesitation, agreeing with this assessment. As soon as Arthur's test was over, Jasmine and Sylvie rushed towards him. Together they left the arena, following Caspian, who felt some dissatisfaction with this duel. The battle between Noda and the guild manager was the last one, after which George announced the end of the final stage, and asked the participants to come to the registration desk to receive an adventurer card. Everyone began to disperse, and Arthur looked after Caspian, who turned out to be his first serious opponent since his training with Virion. It was a test of strength. Although he saw the guild manager in action, he still didn't learn more about him then. What kind of person was hiding behind that calm and balanced mask? After a serious battle with the candidate, Caspian returned to his off level. He sighed heavily and adjusted his hair, trying to push away the thoughts that were previous. At this point he was unable to return to his work due to obsessive thoughts related to the battle. As an examiner for the mysterious figure brought in by Miss Flamesworth, he never got his questions answered, but he felt a real sense of tension in combat. Despite his AA rank, for the first time in his life he met a candidate who made him fight at such a level. He sighed heavily and adjusted his hair, trying to push away the thoughts that were preventing him from working. At that moment, the stunned examiners loudly burst into his office, and George immediately asked in a panic to explain what had happened during this exam. Their behavior noticeably got on the manager's nerves, but he calmly replied that they should close the door behind them when they entered his office. George, realizing his guilt, decided to carefully close the door so as not to expose his colleague, because they both could suffer from an orange stage at the age of 11, which was unheard of among humans. Answering, they ran to Caspian's desk and began asking panicked questions about what was going on. They were very concerned about the fact that they had received more B-class candidates in one day than they had in the last 4 months. What was even more disturbing was the fact that all three of them looked like children. Equally shocking to them was the fact that one of them had an unheard of light orange stage at the age of 11, which was unheard of among humans. Answering all the questions at once, Caspian asked if they remembered what had happened 6 months ago. George, whose mind was in turmoil, showed incredible concentration around the chaos in his head, while his more perceptive colleague noted that it was then that the first tournament between the three races took place. Reaching for his nightstand, Caspian replied that that was the first time he had seen Caspian read Lucas Weeks's file and confirmed that he was a half-elf living in Saipan. He had been informed a few weeks ago that the ban on elves and dwarves obtaining adventurers' licenses in Saipan had been lifted. Taking out a journal with his notes, he said that there were several distinguished examinees in the group of candidates that day. George slammed his hands on the table in surprise, and asked if that meant all three were either dwarves or elves. Still keeping a low profile, Caspian read Lucas Weeks's file and confirmed that he was a half-elf living in Saipan. His birth details were classified, but the steward guessed that he was likely born to an elven slave. Based on this logic, he confirmed his assumption with the well-known words that the House of Weeks had always had a bad reputation due to the fact that they used foul methods to breed the best magicians of their kind. Still, Caspian couldn't help him part in the final exam. Elijah Knight was a real mystery to Caspian himself, a deity with fire, despite his elven ancestry. He awakened at the age of 8, which is young even by elven standards. He was forced to become an adventurer, to further improve his ability through actual combat. It seems his family realized that beast cores and elixirs no longer had any effect. As for the second boy, he was the one who got a B class, without even taking part in the final exam. Elijah Knight was a real mystery to Caspian himself. According to the dossier, his origins are unknown, but he grew up among dwarves from a young age. He was later sent as one of the first representatives of the Darv Kingdom to settle in the human kingdom. Even with these mysterious details, Miss Emily still couldn't understand why he was automatically assigned a B class without being tested. In answering this question, Caspian clarified the inblood that caused him fear and even suffocation. Caspian glanced at his notes and admitted that he had been able to use his powers to his advantage. Despite this, his abilities had been confirmed and the person sponsoring him was not someone the manager could argue with. Caspian's sharp mind did not give him peace, because he was still curious about what abilities this interesting adventurer had. Next up for discussion was the one Caspian called the masked amplifier. George immediately understood who they were talking about. He remembered that terrifying, overwhelming thirst for blood that caused him fear and even suffocation. Caspian glanced at his notes and admitted that he had no idea who this note guy was. No matter how hard he tried to find logical clues, he always came up short. He could barely contain his excitement about this guy. One thing he could say for sure was that Noda was clearly not a member of a noble family of elves or dwarves. He was sure of that. He admitted that he had entered the arena with him because he was simply curious about what kind of person he was, since he was sponsored by Miss Flamesworth. At this point, Emily first heard it mentioned that Noda had given them would soon become public knowledge. Adjusting his glasses, he said with the fact that Lucas was a white scion. According to her, this house was famous for the fact that the most powerful magicians of their kingdom, who had an affinity with fire, were born and raised in it. Hearing this, George, who knew nothing in the world except how to swing a sword, found in this the answer to why he was so skilled in fire magic. Putting his notebook back in his desk, Caspian warned that the information he had given them would soon become public knowledge. Adjusting his glasses, he said with a stern and warning look that he hoped the two of them would refrain from discussing the matter with others until an official statement was made. In response, Emily and George simultaneously nodded their heads obediently. The examiners then returned to the registration desk to assist with entering the data into the rooms. It seemed to him that the enemy was not yet accustomed to his own body. He could not imagine that he could not have a mask amplifier nicknamed Note fighting him. He was convinced that his fire magic was unique and also very effective. Although he remained silent in response to George's words, he felt that George was wrong, knowing that it was the swordsmanship that made this mysterious adventurer a monster. What was strange to him was that Noda's movements were a little erratic at times. It seemed to him that the enemy was not yet accustomed to his own body. He could not imagine how terrifying Note would be when he grew up. However, he was especially interested in the obvious fact that with the lifting of the ban, elves and dwarves would be able to become more than just adventurers. These guys could also become students of the institutions of the Saipan Kingdom. With an anticipatory smile, the guild manager, with the help of a magic ball, to look at what her friend was doing. Watching Arthur's life at home, truly entering a new and exciting era. Meanwhile in Eleanor's kingdom, their princess, Tesha, was still bored. Sighing heavily, she thought about what happened the other day. Despite the fact that she had been training all this time, thoughts about Arthur did not leave her head, which is why she began to pester her aunt. Arriving at her home, she pressed on her pity and forced her, with the help of a magic ball, to look at what her friend was doing. Watching Arthur's life at home, she saw his happy smile when he was around his family. However, when she saw him next to Lily, she began to feel an unpleasant sensation in her chest. The thought of what she had seen haunted her for the next few days. Standing on one of the balconies of their castle, she nervously kicked the railing while watching the birds. She was haunted by the knowledge that she should be happy that Arthur treated him better while he was around. On the other hand, like any girl, she accused him of devious behavior around some girl who praised her for the progress in her training was haunting her. Returning to her room, she nervously banged the doors, shouting that she was the first to become Arthur's friend. She did not yet understand that the feeling that was haunting her was a feeling of jealousy. The elven princess was afraid that she might lose Arthur. Thinking back, she began to regret her actions, thinking that she should have treated him better while he was around. On the other hand, like any girl, she accused him of treating her like a child. When her door suddenly opened, she was scared out of her wits, afraid that someone would see her with the magic ball that contained Arthur's image. As it turned out, it was her grandfather, Varian, who came in shouting that he had good news. Despite her attempts to hide what she was doing, he said he noticed she was using the orb to spy on Arthur again. As soon as he told her he saw what she was hiding, a pillow flew into his face and Tess began to nervously grin again, said that he had very good news. A moment later, the princess shuddered when her grandfather said that he was being thrown in his direction. Varian began to mock his granddaughter, saying that although he was all for Arthur becoming his grandson, he thought it was a little early for her to be involved in such things. Tess began to get angry at the thought of being considered a pervert. Understanding her feelings, Grandpa stopped mocking her and sat down next to her, and asked her not to be upset at his stupid jokes. Turning away from her grandfather, Tess began to cool down a little while Varian again said that he had very good news. A moment later, the princess shuddered when her grandfather said that she would have the opportunity to attend the same school as Arthur. Her gaze suddenly began to shine. She frightened her grandfather with her inadequate interest in this proposal. At that moment, the princess's parents also entered the room, and her mother, asking her to calm down, confirmed her grandfather's words, saying that he had close ties with the director of the Xyrus Academy, of the younger generations of elves and dwarves with humans at Xyrus's academy. Varian was already bragging about her successes. Naturally, the principal was talking about the amplifier with an affinity for 4 elements, which was Arthur. Returning to the previous topic, Varian clarified that it was a little more complicated than just sending her to school. Speaking of which, Mom asked if she remembered the Continental Tournament. Alduin continued by saying that they were discussing the terms of the joint education of the younger generations of elves and dwarves with humans at Xyrus's academy, while Varian spoke the words of the headmaster that everything would go smoothly, because by the time Arthur began attending the academy, she would already be there. With a kind smile, the father who brought this good news wished her good luck, and said that for such a goal, she would have to train hard together with her grandfather. The fact that elves, dwarves, and humans would be studying at this academy at the same time was such an intense battle with Caspian. In response, Arthur said that everything was fine. Despite the opportunity to study with Arthur, that she promised herself she would do everything to achieve this goal. At that moment, her eyes sparkled with joy, and her ears began to move quickly. After the final round of the adventure exam was over, Arthur, Jasmine, and Sylvie sat down in the main hall of the guild, waiting for their turn. Seeing Arthur's thoughtfulness, Jasmine asked if he was okay. She was still worried about how he was feeling after such an intense battle with Caspian. In response, Arthur said that everything was fine, despite the fact that he had to try hard to survive the exam. Looking at his hands, he admitted that it was actually kind of fun for him. Remembering the mysterious guild manager, Arthur asked Jasmine if she knew Caspian personally. It was a rather awkward question, so she immediately looked away. In a hesitant tone, she said that in a sense it was true, and they did indeed know each other. Speaking about this, she said with a feeling of awkwardness, that her father has close connections with some people, or just a strange short man. Seeing him in front of the counter, the worker thanked him about this. Sylvie began to worry, and whined pitifully that it was worth interrupting this reconnaissance operation, so as not to hurt her heart. Luckily, this awkward moment was interrupted by Mistress Mary, who called the adventurer nicknamed Noda to the reception desk. As he passed by the onlookers, who had failed to achieve a good result in the final stage, he overheard them discussing how Noda seemed like a crazy child, or just a strange short man. Seeing him in front of the counter, The worker thanked him for waiting, and said that they had already received and processed the message about the results of his training fight. After these words, she held out a small box towards him, in which, on a soft pillow, was his card. With a smile on her face, she congratulated him on behalf of the Saipan Kingdom's Adventurers Guild, and welcomed him into their ranks. Arthur now had access to the dungeon, and he was already among them. Showing her past, she said that he was now an adventurer like his parents, and the geckos suddenly approached him. Turning towards them, he saw how they began to fawn, demonstrating their sympathy and support. Arthur and Sylvie did not appreciate such behavior, considering them pathetic. Although they did not say anything, they would have liked to answer that they, the plebeians, should train more. At that moment, Jasmine gently placed her hand on his shoulder. She reminded him that although he was a newcomer, he was already among them. Showing her past, she said that he was now an adventurer like his parents, and the guys from the Horned Twins team. Looking at his past, Arthur was glad that he had achieved this goal. As an adventurer under the alias of Noda, he was glad to be free from the bonds that held Arthur Laven's life. However, at that very moment, his attitude towards the situation changed. Previously, he believed that he was limited by his body and age, but the duel with Caspian clarified many things for him. Now, in the past, he had used most of his meager Kai reserves to perfect the simplest of techniques, as well as Sylvie's beastly will. He didn't deny that his current skills were a must for development in this world. Now he reevaluated how he had allocated his time. In the past, it became obvious to him that he had been too preoccupied with the abilities he had acquired when he came into this world. So much so, that he had given up learning what he had been best at before. In the past, he had used most of his meager Kai reserves to perfect the simplest of techniques. In this world, his limitations did not exist, so he had to figure out how to prioritize. Arthur was so deep in his thoughts that he didn't notice how he hit someone who was standing in his way. Looking up, he apologized for what happened. As it turned out, the guy he encountered was also a newbie among the adventurers. Arthur immediately realized that he was one of the examinees, the one who had also missed the meeting for new B-class adventurers that he had not been informed about. In response, he didn't see any problem with it, so he replied that everything was fine. Their short dialogue was noticed by the last of the examinees who received a B grade. Approaching the guys, the impudent Lucas asked if they knew each other and what was going on with them. With an arrogant look and a cocky grin, Weeks, who had his 2 servants and 2 guards behind him, asked if he had missed a meeting for new B-class adventurers that he had not been informed about. In response, Arthur calmly asked why he needed to know, and then suggested that he was planning to throw another tantrum after learning he had not been invited. The provocation worked perfectly. When Noda hurt the half-elf's pride, he angrily replied that there was no point in being insolent just because they were in the same class. Moving closer to Arthur, Lucas pointed his finger at him and said in a disgusting tone. In response, he wanted to say that he had spoken to a newcomer named Elijah, but when he looked at the bottom, he asked them not to forget where their place was. After these words, without even saying goodbye, he walked past, brushing against Arthur's shoulder. Looking at this primitive child, Arthur thought with uneasiness that this was the most stereotypical behavior for an annoying side character. After Lucas left, Jasmine approached Arthur and asked what had happened. In response, he wanted to say that he had spoken to a newcomer named Elijah, but when he looked at the place where he had been standing, he discovered that he had quietly left. Asking what they would do next, Arthur suggested that she wanted to take a task from the notice board. Looking at him in surprise, Jasmine replied in a bored tone that with his skills, doing that would be a waste of time. So she had something else in mind. In the end, they headed back to the city, or more precisely, to its borders. When they approached the portal to the Animal Glader, they found themselves on the other side of the portal. The Animal Glades lived up to their name. It was a store permission from representatives of the guild, or the royal family. In response, the boys showed their IDs, and Jasmine asked if Arthur needed to stock up on anything before they set off. The dwarf adventurer with a large backpack on his back replied that he had brought everything he would need for the next week. Looking around the city, she told Arthur that in that case it was time for them to go. A moment later they found themselves on the other side of the portal. The Animal Glades lived up to their name. It was a spacious place away from the cities with beautiful, untouched nature. Looking around, Arthur thoughtfully wondered if this place was not too quiet. As it turned out, the answer to his question was that they had only arrived at an outpost at the foot of the great mountains, and most of this area had long been explored. Pointing at some poor guy who hadn't even gotten through Saitama's training, Jasmine said that low-class adventurers also used this area to train and gather them because such a situation was not dangerous, but would definitely strengthen his character. And taking advantage of the moment, Jasmine explained that the liquids that these animals produce in their scent glands are used in many potions and elixirs, so there are always tasks for them. Passing by the fallen loser, Arthur, observing this pitiful scene, asked if they needed to help him. Jasmine, without even turning around to look at the adventurer lying on the ground, calmly answered that it was better to leave him because such a situation was not dangerous, but would definitely strengthen his character. This place turned out to be quite interesting not only for Arthur, but also for Sylvie. While walking through the clearing, Sylvie noticed a small fox that naturally possessed a mana aura. At that moment she jumped off her dad's shoulder and Arthur asked in surprise where she was going. In response, Sylvie said that she wanted to eat to become stronger, seeing Sylvie's reaction to the poor hurry, saying that their first stop would be late in the day, as it was getting quite unsafe at night. She thought Arthur wanted to follow her, but he responded guardedly that Sylvie would be fine, as he could sense her clearly through the bond. Jasmine was glad that everything was fine. She also remembered that the beast glades had a denser mana level, which meant that Arthur and Sylvie's communication range would be much greater than before. Placing her hand on his shoulder, Jasmine suggested that they hurry, saying that their first stop would be late in the day, as it was getting quite unsafe at night. Using wind magic, Jasmine sped up and asked Arthur to keep up. Looking back at Sylvia as she disappeared over the horizon, Arthur wondered if this was how parents felt when their child went off to school for the first time. All this time, they were constantly close. He did not have to worry about her safety. From the moment he was born, they had a very strong connection, and he felt a kind of parental feeling towards her from the sudden jog, and couldn't catch his breath for a long time. If it weren't for the man about whether everything would be okay, trusting her strength and intelligence, he wished her to be careful and sped up with wind magic to keep up with Jasmine. Despite the great distance they had traveled, they managed to arrive at a good place to set up camp before night fell. While Jasmine was setting up camp alone, Arthur took off his mask. He lay on the grass, exhausted from the sudden jog, and couldn't catch his breath for a long time. If it weren't for the mana circulation technique that Sylvie taught him, he would never have been able to keep up with her. Jasmine continued gathering branches for the fire. As she passed Arthur, she noticed that he had finally regained consciousness, so she commented on how impressed she was that he was able to keep up with her even though she was slower than usual, even though he was in the light red stage. After preparing the wood for the fire, Jasmine was very happy to be in this place. Looking at the fire, Jasmine said it was where she planned to set up camp. After that, she used the fire element to light a fire. Using this element, she again remembered her family, which spoiled her mood. Sitting down next to Arthur, who was reading some book, Jasmine noticed that his mana beast had not yet returned. She was worried about whether Sylvie would be okay, but Arthur reassured her by telling her that she was telling him about the latest events, and that she was very happy to be in this place. Looking at the fire, Jasmine said that it wasn't strange because having to be indoors most of the time probably puts quite a lot of pressure on her. After finishing reading and closing the book, Arthur agreed with her words and added that she was definitely enjoying life now. Turning to Jasmine, he asked why she wanted to become an adventurer. Judging by her reaction, it also had something to do with her family. Arthur probably wanted to know more about her family, but once again he hurt her feelings with his quest. She had seen him notice her reaction to the mention of family back in the Adventurers Guild. Speaking about her family, Arthur was a bit awkward, realizing that this question had touched her in a big way. Having collected her thoughts, Jasmine finally decided to answer. As expected, she just wanted to distance herself from her family. The suspicion that this was related to her family were confirmed. Arthur knew that digging further would be too cruel. Seeing his concern, Jasmine said that everything was fine. She admitted that she had seen him notice her reaction to the mention of family back in the Adventurers Guild. Speaking about her family, she recalled that House Flamesworth made a great contribution to the war against the elves. This was due to the fact that their house produced many powerful mages, both spellcasters and enhancers. Their bloodline, having an affinity with fire, is unrivaled, and her parents are very proud of it, because fire is considered the strongest of the elements. That's why his expression suddenly changed and He even raised his voice, nervously saying that this whole situation was a good thing. But when all the tests she had to undergo showed that she had no affinity with fire, her family began to consider her worthless. Looking at her hand, Jasmine began to use the only element she had a true affinity for. It was the wind element, and she felt a certain sadness as she looked at it, as it had alienated her from her family and made her an outcast. She was suddenly distracted by Arthur making a displeased sound. His expression suddenly changed, and he even raised his voice, nervously saying that this whole situation was too stupid. The boy began to prove that it was possible to understand that there was a difference between the levels of the Manticore, but it was completely unfounded, even absurd, to create a hierarchy for mages based on affinity with the elements. Jumping up and raising his hands, he shouted that there was no elemental affinity that was inherently better than the others. Calling it obvious behavior, she apologized, saying that it was because he was usually very reserved, so he would use his power. After his words, Jasmine could hardly contain her emotions. Arthur noticed that a smile had appeared on her face, and her cheeks were strangely puffed out while her head was lowered down and part of her face was hidden by her long dark hair. Suddenly she couldn't stand it and began to laugh, loudly but subduedly at the way Arthur defended her honor. A little embarrassed by her behavior, she apologized, saying that it was because he was usually very reserved, so it was surprising to see how angry he got about this story. Awkwardly scratching his cheek, Arthur thought with a kind smile that he was most likely overexcited because her words made him remember his past life. The biggest weakness he had back then was in his dantian, which is the place where the life force Ki resides and is stored. The dantian is like the Manticore of this world, and back then his was weaker than average. In order to use a small amount of energy, Arthur explained that he considered the whole situation absurd and unfair. In response to his words, people limited their potential by elemental affinity. Things were different. Having a dark yellow core at the age of only 24, which is really surprising, Jasmine still kept herself away from her own family. Earlier Arthur noticed the constant sadness in her eyes and the way she looked at his relationship with his parents and sister. Speaking about his sudden aggression, he explained that he considered the whole situation absurd and unfair. In response to his words, Jasmine only shook her head from side to side with a smile. Whether it was boosters against spellcasters or one element against another, she had long since come to terms with the fact that humans were always looking for ways to feel superior. It was their nature. Besides, she doesn't regret becoming an adventurer because the twin horns have always treated her well. For the first time, the always aloof sleeping bags went to sleep in the open air. Before falling asleep, Jasmine decided to raise the topic of the fire. Arthur was distracted from his thoughts about her plight by the fact that the stick she was using to move the coals in the fire suddenly caught fire. At this point, Jasmine found it funny to be able to use the element at Arthur's disposal, so she grabbed his hand. Understanding her intentions, Arthur extinguished her wand with the element of water. It was already late, so they also put out the fire and, taking out their sleeping bags, went to sleep in the open air. Before falling asleep, Jasmine decided to raise the topic that was troubling her. Looking back, she thought she could have made him choose her as his guard. Comparing herself to the rest of the Twin Horns Adventurers team, she admitted that she is not the friendliest or most outgoing. Not considering herself one of the smartest on their team, she said that perhaps she had made a mistake, as they should have asked his opinion first. Feeling her excitement, winking at her, he said with a smile that he thought it was just what he needed for his adventures, to be surprisingly gentle and kind. In response to his compliment, which was not in keeping with his age, Jasmine cooled him down with a gust of wind. A little embarrassed, she replied that it was not nice to tease older girls about him. Although she wasn't really seriously offended, Arthur still said that he was sincerely glad that she had volunteered. He also admitted that he is very happy that she is not afraid to tell him when he is wrong. Winking at her, he said with a smile that he thought it was just what he needed for his adventures, especially considering that he was prone to going a little overboard sometimes. Arthur's words touched Jasmine again, who for the first time found herself so talkative. She saw him from a completely different side than before, and also heard several pleasant words addressed to her. Breaking the awkwardness of his sincerity, Arthur reminded them that they really needed to get some sleep, as he rolled over and heard her words, but he could not answer anything, because he really was not the child he seemed to be to her. She continued her speech by saying that when she talks to him, she doesn't feel like she's talking to a child. When she said There was only silence in response. She really hadn't spoken to anyone so sincerely for a long time, and she felt better because she had opened her soul to Arthur. Thinking that he had already fallen asleep, she closed her eyes, gradually falling asleep. In fact, Arthur was not yet asleep and heard her words, but he could not answer anything, because he really was not the child he seemed to be. The morning began with the pleasant chirping of birds and the sun's rays falling from the clear sky. Arthur, as usual, could not wake up, and even before he opened his eyes he sleepily told Sylvie that she was too heavy to sleep on him. However, as soon as he opened one eye, he saw something strange in front of him. Sylvie was a little different from what he was used to. A strange thing was sitting on him, an animal that looked like a cross between a goat and a cat, with drool coming out of its mouth after catching a fish in the river. Wishing him a good morning, Jasmine said that she had enjoyed this and was unlikely to be Sylvie. Realizing this, he began to rise with a panicked cry, throwing off this mixture of goat and rabbit. The nightmare he saw as soon as he woke up left him with a sense of terror that made him try to catch his breath. Having calmed down a little, he was distracted by the pleasant smell of food. As it turned out, Jasmine had already managed to wake up, catch some fish, and even start cooking it over the fire. She was standing nearby, wiping her hair after catching a fish in the river. Wishing him a good morning, Jasmine said that she had enjoyed this little comedy show, thanks to which Arthur had finally woken up. Rubbing his eyes, Arthur replied that she should have woken him up to help her with her morning duties. It wasn't strange to hear from her that she had already tried to wake him up, but he hadn't even moved. Awkwardly scratching the back of his head, Arthur apologized, saying that he had such a bad habit that only Sylvie could overcome. Since Arthur was already awake, Jasmine offered him something to eat and also asked him to ask Sylvie whether she should join them or not. It sounded like a great idea and Arthur agreed. Turning to Sylvie, Arthur invited her to come to their place for something to eat. As it turned out, she already had food, because she had just caught a strange rabbit that looked like a goat. Because of their connection, Arthur sensed what she was doing at that moment. Even though it was disgusting to him, he couldn't stop her from doing such things. So he told Jasmine that Sylvie could manage without them. After a dinner of freshwater fish, the boys began to get ready for the journey. Arthur tightened his belt securely so as not to lose his belly. While dressing for the journey, he asked where they would go next. Jasmine replied that one of the reasons she brought him to this place was to spar with him. Hearing this, Arthur was surprised by her plan. As it turns out, Jasmine also noticed that his fighting style sometimes seemed strange. She explained her observations by saying that sometimes he looks like he knows how to do something in his head, but his body doesn't obey him. And indeed, when he fought a very dangerous opponent like Caspian, some of his moves looked ridiculous. And in fact, such moments could have led to him getting seriously injured in battle. Arthur agreed with her, saying that sparring was indeed a good idea. Still, he was curious to know what kind of sparring she was thinking about. While taking out their daggers, Jasmine said that she needed to know his physical limits before they went into the dungeon or took on missions. So she asked him to limit his mana usage during the sparring and only use it to dull his blade. Arthur did not want it. He was forced to use this blade. He only drew it from its sheath once. The day soon as his hand was near the hilt of the unremarkable weapon, Jasmine asked him to use the second blade, which he had not yet demonstrated in combat. Arthur couldn't believe that she was the first to reveal his secret. When he asked her how she knew that, Jasmine explained her guess by saying that he was too practical to carry around a simple wooden stick without a reason. The secret was revealed, and although Arthur did not want it, he was forced to use this blade. He only drew it from its sheath once, the day Sylvie found it in the warehouse. Taking the sword in his hands, he asked Jasmine if they should spar in this particular place. Jasmine agreed that a more comfortable place could be found, so she offered to follow her. There was a nice lawn next to them, in the middle of which only 2 large stones could interfere with the fight. As they began to spar, her fighting stance was different from her usual one, as she used twin daggers, which were only effective at close range. Arthur continued to surprise, his real weapon was no exception. Taking a fighting stance, he suggested that they begin the battle when Jasmine was ready. The weapon, which he had never spoken about before, looked so unusual and mysterious that Jasmine had even more questions about the identity of this unusual child. Despite this, she had no intention of interrupting this moment for conversation and assumed a fighting stance. Her fighting stance was different from her usual one, as she used twin daggers, which were only effective at close range. Arthur began to adapt his breathing to using his real strength without using mana. He couldn't even remember how long it had been since he relied on his body's strength alone. He had never used this blade in a fight against humans before, so he wondered if it would be able to do anything against an experienced fighter like Jasmine. In just a moment, who had let him land an unsuccessful blow, was plunging a dagger into his exposed back, which was a direct strike. After knocking his sword away, she took the initiative and struck. Since she was using 2 daggers, Arthur decided that the best tactic was to dodge as long as possible. As soon as she tried to strike again, it was blocked by the sheath. In this way, Arthur was able to create an opportunity for a direct strike with his sword. But Jasmine read his movements and managed to step aside. A moment later, Jasmine, who had let him land an unsuccessful blow, was plunging a dagger into his exposed back. Arthur continued to notice her movements, but at the same time, he was drawing conclusions. Fighting such a skilled close-range fighter was no less rewarding than fighting Caspian, who combined his magic and sword-wielding skills. While blocking punches, Arthur began to notice mistakes that weren't even related to the fact that he still had poor control over his body. Jasmine turned out to be an incredible fighter who calculated her moves in advance. During another attack, she took advantage of the moment when Arthur blocked her defense. His sparring with Jasmine confirmed the fears he had had after his bad stance with the sword during the fight. Once Arthur lost his scabbard, the pressure on his defense increased significantly. At that moment, he thought it was a good idea to jump back and return to the fight, imposing his own rules. However, immediately after this, he became convinced that this way, he would not change anything anyway. Jasmine's speed, even without using mana and wind magic, was incredible. Arthur could only defend himself, waiting to find some kind of breach in her impeccable defense. His sparring with Jasmine confirmed the fears he had had after his battle with Caspian. The techniques she used during the fight were more varied and unusual than he could have imagined. Arthur was forced to act according to the situation, as he could not predict Jasmine's next move. Being almost obsessed with learning about the new and wonderful, which was what magic was to him, mistakes. The battle with Jasmine ended. Unable to withstand her pressure, Arthur fell on his butt, confident in his sword skills, causing him to stop spending time on these trainings. Only by feeling the superiority of his opponent could he realize this. His skills in magic became a crutch he relied on too heavily. Now he realized that this only hid his limits and shortcomings, preventing him from improving his use of weapons in this body. Realizing such things was an excellent opportunity for him to correct his mistakes. The battle with Jasmine ended. Unable to withstand her pressure, Arthur fell on his butt. His breathing was ragged and his hair was completely soaked with sweat from the intense sparring. He had to admit that Jasmine was much better. Sheathing the daggers, Jasmine assessed his skills, saying that although his physical attributes were still lacking and he sometimes had awkward movements, he made up for it with the precision of his techniques. She also noted that his intuition and reflexes were at the highest level, almost crawls. Even using magic, he replied that it was too long. After he finished his adventure, in response to her honest analysis of his abilities, Arthur thanked her, but noted that he knew she had given him a head start. In response to these words, Jasmine said that he had once again confirmed his frightening intuition. He had no choice but to laugh at such compliments. When Jasmine said that he would become stronger during missions and dungeon crawls, even using magic, he replied that it was too long. Arthur knew without her that when he became a teenager, his body would become much stronger, but he could not wait that long. Looking at his palms, tired from training, he said that he was several years ahead of his peers in mana manipulation, so it would be more effective to focus solely on sword fighting without relying on mana. Jasmine thought his words were reckless. She couldn't believe that he wanted to go down into the dungeon and not use mana there. Since then, nothing has changed in the lives of ordinary adventurers. They still enjoyed their freedom, but this endeavor needed decades to master their sword. In response, Arthur said that in order to master the art of swordsmanship, he would fight without using mana for 2 years. He was very determined in his plans. Looking at Jasmine with sincere eyes that held nothing back, he said that this was all he needed for the time being. Time flew by and 2 whole years have passed since then. Nothing has changed in the lives of ordinary adventurers. They still enjoyed their freedom, adventures, and time to meet friends in a nice, noisy place. After a few glasses of strong alcohol, arguments and interesting stories began, among which were some that were hard to believe. Rumors spread quickly, but the one that stood out above all others concerned a man who was fairly new to the matter, the veteran adventurer. Not to notice him. Even with this more detailed information, the veteran adventurer with the scar, and shouted that these rumors were nothing more than lies. Despite his beliefs, his friends were of a completely different opinion. A guy with a weird mohawk on his head shared information that his friend was once on the same team with that famous swordsman. According to him, the hero of the rumors travels with Jasmine Flamesworth, and he himself is short, so it is difficult not to notice him. Even with this more detailed information, the veteran adventurer with the scar on his face had a hard time believing his words, but he asked what the so-called acquaintance had said about that guy. With a sly grin, his friend said he thought the rumors were true. Snapping his fingers, he said with fire in his eyes that he believed that the famous swordsman was indeed not a mage. It was hard to believe such a thing, so the skeptical veteran once again responded that it was some kind of nonsense. Outraged that everyone believed these rumors, he didn't even notice how he acted that B-rank boosters couldn't even handle low-level dungeons on their own. The veteran expressed the leader of their team said with displeasure that either the swordsman in the mask belonged to the amplifiers, or the rumors about his strength were simply exaggerated. He also found the stories about the man absurd. The one that infuriated him most was the one about him clearing out the dungeon all by himself. The guy who had been hunting monsters all his life didn't think it was possible, and said that B-rank boosters couldn't even handle low-level dungeons on their own. The veteran expressed displeasure at being asked to believe that a mere swordsman had done something like that. His friend in the yellow shirt partially agreed with him, so he suggested taking some of these rumors with a grain of salt. His pride was also hurt by such rumors. With a smug smile, he asked not to forget that Jasmine Flamesworth was traveling with that mysterious adventurer, so it was logical to assume that she probably helped him in the dungeon. The veteran agreed with his words without hesitation that the swordsman was such a hot topic. He believed some rumors that could partly justify such success of the mage were probably not as strong as they said. As he rose from his chair, he also said that he was more than sure that half of these rumors were Flamesworth's fault. His pride turned out to be so great that he even switched to insults, saying that if some crazy warrior called himself a swordsman then he was ready to defeat him at any time. His more reserved companion felt a bit uneasy. He still couldn't believe that this masked swordsman was such a hot topic. He believed some rumors that could partly justify such success of the mysterious adventurer, namely that they say that he was a student of Jasmine Flamesworth. Even if it was far-fetched, the most absurd thing to him was not only that the masked guy had been promoted to B-rank right after the exam, but also that he had recently risen to a rank. While the guys were having fun, he choked on alcohol for years. After rethinking the situation, he finally began to understand why their leader Abel only confirmed that he was not happy with even the thought that such a thing was possible. Given the rumors, it could be said that if this was true, Noda had achieved a rank just 2 years into his career. This is what angered this ordinary boy the most. He hasn't seen any progress for a long time, being a C-rank adventurer, who was on the verge of failing the rank-up test for the past 3 years. After rethinking the situation, he finally began to understand why their leader Thurman was so angry about the mention of Nod. After all, it was like a humiliation towards him. After all, he was a veteran among the B-rank enhancers, so the masked sword look was enough to understand that this guy was a swordsman. However, what was more interesting was that after the exam, he was drinking and enjoying drinks. After completed missions, new customers came to this establishment. Usually at this time, the modest bar no longer saw guests, because usually only regulars drank here. Everyone turned their attention to the front door, the creak of which stopped the noise inside the bar. When the guy in the yellow t-shirt who was excited by the rumors looked towards the door, he was horrified to realize who had come to them. Just one look was enough to understand that this guy was a swordsman. However, what was more interesting was that his appearance was completely similar to the description of the swordsman who was the hero of the latest rumors. A swordsman named Noda who was rumored to not use magic shocked everyone present with his visit. Seeing him, Thurman began to lose control of himself. Strong alcohol, seeing his confidence and composure in every move, they no longer doubted the road of Noda and said that the guy from the rumors was dead. While the boys were speechless, the captain of their adventurer team disrespectfully called the hero of rumors a tiny swordsman that everyone was talking about. While the fool was raging, everyone was afraid to even move, realizing that in front of them was indeed the man who was the cause of all these crazy rumors. seeing his confidence and composure in every move. They no longer doubted that this was indeed Note in the flesh. Seeing Thurman walking towards this terrifying guy, his friend asked in confusion what he was trying to do. However, the arrogant commander of their team could no longer be stopped. Leaning on his sword, he stood next to Arthur and, blocking his path, asked where his dear little protector was. Of course, he was asking about Jasmine, but Arthur didn't care about such a disrespectful tone. It was a great idea to restore his honor. The people present began to panic as he grabbed his sword. Although Thurman was the first to exhibit this behavior, he was the only one who eventually went berserk. His pride was greatly hurt by the fact that Arthur, having answered this question, moved on, ignoring his presence. Covering his face as he laughed arrogantly, he gripped the hilt of his sword angrily. It's hard to say whether he was that drunk or stupid, but he decided that starting a fight was a great idea to restore his honor. The people present began to panic as he grabbed his sword with both hands and, using the aura of mana, swung both hands to strike the masked guy. The guys around him tried to stop him, saying that he himself knew that it was impossible to fight here, much less kill someone. However, Thurman thought that the masked man had started to think that he was better than him due to his fame from false rumors. He couldn't understand what happened. His blade simply hit the surface, but he couldn't tell if the increasing the speed of his blade with the wind element. A powerful surge of his energy created real chaos inside the room. People began to run away from the epicenter of the battle that the man had started. When the fervor dissipated, Thurman, who was already anticipating the sweetness of his victory over the guy from the rumors, froze in surprise. Cold sweat appeared on his face. He couldn't understand what happened. His blade simply hit the surface, but he couldn't tell if the masked guy dodged it or if he himself missed.